Good evening. At this time, I'd like to convene the Policy and Services Committee for Tuesday, March 10th, 2015. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Berman.
Here.
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Wellbach.
Here.
Councilmember Du Bois. Here. 4 present.
Thank you. Our first item is oral communications for items that are not otherwise on the agenda, and I have no speaker cards, so we will proceed to the first agendized item, which is the utility meter audit of procurement, inventory, and retirement of utility meters. And does our city auditor wish to proceed? Thank you.
Yes. Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Harriet Richardson, City Auditor. Mimi Wen, who conducted the audit, is not here tonight. She had an accident over the weekend and will be out for several weeks, so I'm presenting on her behalf. So the audit objective was to determine if proper procedures were followed in utilities to procure, manage, and retire utility meters, and to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of those procedures. We reviewed meter data for the 11,000 meters that the city purchased over 5 fiscal years. It included water and gas meter data from July 1st, 2009 through June 6, 2014, and electric meter data from July 1st, 2009 through June 30th, 2014. The city has a total of about 74,000 meters, to put that into perspective. We did not try to quantify the full effect of the findings in this audit, because in our next audit, which is on rate and billing accuracy, we're going to do a lot of that, and a lot of the information from this audit will feed into that and be a starting point for where we look for inaccuracies in rates and billings. So our approach for the audit was to look at the utility meter workflow process from procurement to receipt and to receipt and to installation at a service location through retirement. We tried to identify the root causes of the problems that we identified, so that we were really addressing the problem and not just the symptoms. We worked with the city staff most responsible for our process and holding the greatest degree of interest, impact, and expertise on the subject matter. So that included staff in ASD regarding the procurement process, and then utilities for most of the rest of the process, but then back to ASD for part of the retirement process. A couple of key concepts that flow through the audit. A utility meter is the device that measures utility usage. The device and the reading are components in calculating customer bills and city revenues. Utility meters are a city asset and were valued at $13 million in the city's fiscal year 14 financial statements. We talk a lot about internal control in our audits, and in this one it's important because it's not a single event, but a series of actions that occur throughout an entity's operations to help the entity achieve its objectives. In this audit, management should be establishing internal control through the policies and procedures, and those processes should help the entity run its operations efficiently and effectively. So we're talking about making sure that the utility meter process works effectively from the date that a decision is made to buy a meter all the way through the date it's determined that it should be retired. One of the main things you want to do with effective internal controls is minimize the need for rework by having efficient practices, and to also minimize the need to correct errors. We talk about the workflow process throughout this audit. A well-established and maintained meter workflow process supported by technology, which is the city's SAP system, can determine the effectiveness of the use of the meter. Another key concept was data reliability and completeness. They're essential for ensuring that there is accuracy in meter asset management and in utility customer billing. Having accurate data helps protect the asset and its use. There are 6 key steps in the utility meter workflow process, and they fit within the phases of procurement, inventory, and retirement that were the subject of this audit. I'll go through each of these in the next 6 slides. The slides are each organized to show the process relevant to the step, what we found in our audit, the cause, and the reason we felt that it was important to address it in the audit. So the procurement and the specific data for each meter are maintained in the city's SAP Enterprise Resource Planning System. Utilities engineering creates and approves meter specifications and standards. They submit those requests to ASD purchasing for procurement. Purchasing uses that information to set up a master material record in SAP for each type of meter based on its specific attributes. Each meter is supposed to then have its own record under the master meter. That record is intended to be the collective repository for all of the information about that meter throughout the life of the meter. We found that the meters were not set up effectively in SAP. And the main reason that happened is because when utilities engineering develops the specifications, they're performance-based, and those are adequate for utilities' needs, but ASD needed additional information to guide the purchasing process and to ensure that they actually knew what they were buying. The purchasing needed a clear understanding of differences between various meters to know whether to set it up under an existing meter record or to create a new master meter record. This was important because understanding how meters are improved and set up at the onset informs all of the workflow areas, and it also demonstrates how to organize meter data in SAP in a consistent and accurate way, which helps for tracking the asset throughout its life. The second step is when the meter is actually purchased. So when ASD sets up receives the engineering specs and sets up the meter record, it then purchases the meter. It's buying the meter based on the engineering specs, so it's important that they understand specifically what they should be buying based on what those meter specs say. We found that there were inconsistencies in the purchasing data, including information on both the purchases and vendors, descriptions, inventory, and pricing. The reason that happened is that the master meter records for different types of meters were commingled. It's important to understand that the master data file is not just a single file, but a number of tables of information that collectively reflect all of the information for that meter type throughout its life. Organizing the information accurately ensures that complete and reliable information is in SAP to track a meter from the date of purchase through retirement. As an example, a 5/8 inch by 3/4 inch bronze water meter and a 5/8 inch by 3/4 inch water e-meter are the same size, but they're different products with different price points and should therefore each have their own master meter record. If you put them under the same record, which is what we found happening, that's what we mean by commingling. When you have the different price points, you're attaching an incorrect price to one type of meter. The next step is being able to individually identify a meter in SAP. When ASD Stores receives the meters purchased, they receive them into inventory, and each meter has a badge number affixed to it that is affixed at by the manufacturer. The badge number used is so that utilities can easily identify any specific meter that the city owns. However, we found that not all the meters were registered into SAP, and each meter did not have its own badge number affixed at the time of receipt. When a meter was purchased outside of the normal procurement process, it bypassed the inventory process in ASD Stores and went directly to the meter shops. And so in those cases, the utility meter shops affix the badge, usually at the time of installation. But what that meant is that that period of time from when it was initially received until it was installed, it was not in the inventory tracking system, and it was not recorded as a city asset. The reason that's important is because you if you have it tracked from the very beginning, you can follow it through, all the way through installation, and you can track the performance of each meter. When you don't register it, it means that the meter is not being tracked as a city asset during that period, which means our city assets are understated. It also increases the potential for theft when you do not have the meter being tracked in inventory. The next step is once it's actually in inventory and is moving out to be installed. So ASD Stores manages the meter inventory until the point it is ready for installation. At that point, the meter shops request the meters out of inventory. They're issued to utilities, and then utilities takes control for installing the meter. We identified inconsistent practices between the different meter shops. We originally identified having manual inventory management processes during our inventory management audit and expressed concerns about that, and that utilities did not have a clear and consistent way of identifying all meters stored at the shops. So they've improved some of those practices since that time, but we still found some other inconsistencies during this audit. And one of the reasons that happened is that utility staff were not required or trained to use similar processes for efficiency, and also to ensure that the meter could be tracked throughout its life. It's important because the inventory management process is the system that provides data used for planning, accountability, and tracking meters, which are a city asset. Not having that accountability increases the opportunity for losses to occur. It also increases the chance that when the meter is entered in SAP, the data for that meter may not all be entered correctly, and you can end up with discrepancies in billing processes. The next step is actually installing and uninstalling the meter. So the meter shops and operations managers manage meter inventory for installation, uninstallation when a meter is ready to be retired, or for testing. We identified several data discrepancies and errors and inconsistent and ineffective processes for tracking, testing, and analyzing uninstalled and used meters. When they remove a meter, either because it's broken and can't be repaired, they'll either throw it away or they'll test it to see if it can be repaired and reinstalled. So it's important to be able to track that information. This happened because the meter shops sometimes used manual record-keeping methods. There was sometimes a lack of data management and SAP integration. The resulting discrepancies also sometimes affected customer bills. It's important to have data completeness, reliability, and analysis flowing from inventory to installation, because it's a preventive process. You want to prevent errors from occurring so that you don't have to rework later, which is more inefficient. It's always more efficient to prevent those errors than to correct them later. And then the sixth step is when they actually retire meters. There's actually two processes for retiring them. One is the physical retirement, where you're actually disposing of a meter that is no longer able to be used. And the second is what we call a technological retirement, which is retiring the meter in SAP. And that's to get it out of the city's accounting records, so you're no longer counting it as a record. So utility meter shops physically retire the meters and enter the retirement into SAP, but then they notify ASD, Enterprise Accounting, so that ASD can remove it from the accounting records. We found that the meters were often not retired timely, and coordination of the reporting of retired meters was inaccurate. So some examples were that duplicate badge numbers were retired, or sometimes there were long lapses between physical and technological retirement, so it was being retained on the city's records as an asset when it was no longer in use. That happened primarily because of poor meter data records and a lack of understanding of the importance of reconciling and reporting the meter data. As we said earlier, setting up the meters at the beginning of the workflow process through life affects whether or not you can retire it accurately. Having inaccurate meter data can result in inaccurate financial reporting, and in some cases, there was not even a record in SAP to retire against. I do want to mention that some of this data that was carried over from a legacy system, so not all of the data in SAP that is bad was the result of current problems. Some of it was because of older issues with the data that were not identified when it was pulled over from the legacy system. So we summarized these issues into 3 findings, which are listed up above on the screen, and 15 recommendations. I'm not going to read those to you, but since I've already gone over the key issues. But some of the actions taken to date are that ASD and utilities have met so that they can get an understanding of each other's needs for being able to ensure that the records are set up accurately at the time of procurement in SAP. And then our office, Mimi Wen and I have also met with utilities staff to get a better understanding of the issues we identified. The utilities responded to all of the findings that they agreed to implement them. With one of the findings, there's a cost consideration that they'll factor in before they determine how to implement. That ends my presentation, and I'm ready to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Colleagues, would you like to proceed with questions at this time? And I have no speaker cards from the public. City Manager.
Thank you. Just since this is potentially a first time for some of the council members, I did want to state that in the audit process, I think it's clear by the report, we actually also have a formal response process from the subjects of the audit. And when the time is right, whether that's after questions or now, and then you ask questions later, it's completely up to you. Tom Marshall, Assistant Director from Utilities, is here. Val is in DC on a legislative trip, and we, of course, have other utility staff and folks from ASD, should the committee want to have me call them up here.
So it's a good question as to whether we should go ahead and hear the staff response now or after questions. Would you like to hear it now?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, great. Tom, would you like to proceed?
Sure. Tom Marshall, Assistant Director, Utilities. I'm now in operations right now, but I'm usually in engineering. I just want to say that we reviewed the findings, and we do see a merit in a lot of the things that are put forward here in the findings. I think we may disagree on portions of how much of a problem some of these are, but we do agree, and we are working on all of these items in the audit to try to correct them. As Harriet stated, that a lot of these errors date back many, many years. We have 76,000 meters. We've been installing, some of these meters are going to be 20 or 30 years old. One of the issues that come up before is the Southgate meters. I think that showed up in this report too. That was something that happened 20 years ago and was not part of the current process. But I think the point of it is well taken, that it can have impact later on billing sometimes with the customer. So I'm really here to take your questions. We are moving forward with the items in the audit and trying to make corrections in the areas where we can, and to improve the processes.
If I might, thank you. If I could just add a couple of comments. So I don't know to what extent the committee was able to look at the staff's response to the audit. And sometimes it's a little hard to tell what the audit's saying and what the response is saying. It can say agree, and then there's language under that, so you may have questions. But one, I'm just wondering if you could put a little more context to this for the council. I mean, when we're talking about the number of meters that we buy every year, just as an example, the price of the meters, I mean, so that there's clarity about, do these meters cost $1,000 or do they cost $50 and that sort of thing. And then I do think one of the important things to be thinking about, separate from the process of tracking and accounting, and to be honest, I've been in 3 meetings, I think, with Harriet and with the staff, and I would say I don't completely understand the issues that are at play here, and I'm partly relying on the discussion here, but separate for dealing with the impact of some of these issues, it seems to me that you ought to describe the practice about purchasing and the kind of average, what's the term you guys use? Average moving price for meters that's applied. And then that deals with the acquisition. I wouldn't call it necessarily capital costs because these are relatively not expensive pieces of equipment. And one thing was not been clear to me is anything as it relates to a potential billing error, I'm assuming is less about do we have the acquisition costs perfectly nailed on a particular meter than do we somehow, have we misidentified a meter and suddenly the calibration for it and what it's measuring is different. So in an ongoing, in other words, you suddenly say, oh, we thought this was a 3/8 inch meter and it's a 5/8 inch and we're computing prices based on a different sort of usage. To me, that seems like the most important kind of issue related to cost impacts more than just the meter price. And I'm not minimizing that. But I think if Tom could give some context, it would be helpful to the committee.
Okay, so a typical meter, most of our meters are going to be residential meters, and they're going to run in the range of as low as $15 up to in low $100, depending on the meter. So typically, they're not super expensive items. One issue that I think that you mentioned before was the commingling of meters, and that was a one-time occurrence that happened with a particular e-meter where somebody actually made a mistake about reusing a material number twice, and so they ended up commingling together, and we ended up with essentially maybe $50 meters commingled with $100 and some meters, which moved the moving average price that they were bought from the stores from. But we don't actually charge our customers that moving price. The way we bill customers for meters is we set a fee, and it's based on the market price and the price to set the meter, and we set that at one time, and essentially all customers are paying the same. So when we buy them out of the warehouse, we're not changing the price and billing the customer for that price. So essentially, it doesn't really get passed on to the individual customers, but it does affect the pricing as the utility buys them from stores and from the general fund, and that does have some impact on financial things. Although, like I say, these are not high-value items that we're purchasing. As far as, there's a lot of issues, and again, I'm not saying, we're not disagreeing with the importance of the audit. We do think it's important that our processes are smooth and that we do a better job of entering into the system. But a lot of these items in here do not have direct impact on our customers. The thing that impacts the customer is getting them on the right rate schedule, and that's the important thing, is they end up on the right rate schedule, and that's where the charges come from. There are mistakes in the meter records, and a lot of that's legacy things where different systems were used to input the data. There was a system before SAP that we pulled data out. There were inconsistencies in that system when it got loaded into SAP. Those were carried forward. And there's been some issues in the training of our staff and making sure that they get data input consistently into the system, which led to some different just inconsistency in data, but in reality, those don't end up affecting the customer unless they're rate schedule, they're on the wrong rate schedule in the system. So I don't know if that sort of helps to put context.
Can you just do one last thing for me? Because it's sort of, at least struck me as sort of key at the beginning of the process itself on a meter coming into existence, I guess. And that is, why has utilities used this average moving price for meters rather than tracking and accounting specifically for absolutely every meter in the system?
Well, I mean, the pricing of the meter is a warehousing function. It's not, I mean, utilities isn't established the method for SAP to price a meter. That was established at the time SAP was put in place, and the decision was to do moving average price for products as they come in. So essentially, you buy a new meter, it comes in at the new price, you then average it with the ones you purchased previously, and when you sell them out of the warehouse, it's sold at the average price of those items. And so that's just a standard way that the SAP works for selling the meters out of the warehouse.
Thank you. Colleagues who would like to proceed? Tom?
So I have mostly high-level questions, I guess. So how is SAP maintained? Is that done by IT or through SAP directly?
Well, there's SAP, there's a system maintenance, and that's partially IT, and there's a number of business analysts that we have that maintain the system. And in utilities, we have a number of folks, I think around 4, that just maintain the utility billing system in SAP. And then ASD has folks on their side, they're doing the material management portion of that. I think they have at least 2 or 3 people that manage SAP on that side. As far as the data input, that's individual. It's going to be like a meterman in the shop, a laborer that's going to be entering the data.
Yeah. I mean, so did any of the changes involve actually process changes within the software itself?
There could be. So one of the issues we've run into, and with SAP, it's a very complicated system, especially on the retirement side. In some cases, the person that's actually inputting the data is having to go to 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 screens in SAP to get it retired properly. And so there's a recommendation, I believe, in this audit to take a look at that process, to try to take a look at SAP and make that a more efficient process, a more integrated process. Now it's really like 4 individual steps that we're expecting people to remember and do every time. And we're addressing that now by training and trying to make sure that people are trained properly. But it would be better if the system had more checks and controls in it, that it prevented some of these errors from being entered.
I mean, those kinds of solutions seem like relatively high value, and I don't know if we have the capability internally to fix those screens, or it requires consultants.
Right. You know, the thing with SAP is just so expensive to change, and we're looking at that, but it's the issue of how much money we're going to spend to fix this problem. And I think you're going to be hearing later about whether the city's going to be looking at a different ERP or maybe a different utility billing system. So, I mean, we're looking at it also in light of the fact that we may get a different utility billing system, and whether we want to invest heavily in SAP only to have it replaced maybe in 3 or 4 years from now. So that's one of the things we're weighing too before we make a decision to go ahead and change that.
And then, Harriet, I don't know, did you consider any kind of metric for just database inconsistencies? I mean, it seems like there'd be a certain error rate expected for a large database system.
We actually made a recommendation for utilities to establish what's an acceptable error rate. We did not try to identify what is maybe an industry standard, but we did make a recommendation. I think utilities knows where to look for those metrics to see if there's something that's considered a good industry standard.
I think you said the value of the inventory was understated. Was it material? And like, what is the lifetime of a meter? And like, how long do we carry it on our inventory?
So we're depreciating the meters. I believe it's on a 40-year basis, but I think that they generally look at them as a 20-year life, somewhere in there. Tom might know better.
Yeah, I think it depends on the meter and how long they're on the books. So there's a depreciated life, and we'd have to look at each one individually. They might run from around 20 years, maybe up to 40. In some cases, they'll be run long past. A lot of materials will have a run past the depreciation date if they're still operating properly. We just continue to use them until the point where they're unusable or out of calibration.
Yeah.
So a lot of things, we'll bring them back in and test them for calibration. If they're still in calibration, we'll redeploy them and reuse them.
Yeah. So was that a material understatement?
So the amount was not material in reference to the financial statements.
Okay. And again, I'm sorry, I did try to read all this. I'm not sure I absorbed it all. You talked about 2 steps for retiring a meter, the physical and the logical. Is there any reason like something like that can't be combined into one step? Is that?
Well, physical is when you're actually throwing the meter away or recycling it or something like that. The
Yeah.
technological retirement is the retirement in the SAP system and the accounting system.
So the person physically removing it is not entering data at that time?
That's correct. Another thing is we have to bring the meter back in, and it has to be tested before we can dispose of it. So there's an additional process to make sure when we bring it in that it was reading accurately, and the customer has an opportunity to come back and contest the meter read for like 30 days or so after the meter is removed. So we pull it out, we hold it in the shop until the 30 days or so, or I think it's 45 we hold it for, and then that's when we'll technologically retire it after we do that.
Okay. So, I think it was mentioned that, again, overall, in terms of size of utility, maybe some of these things weren't so material, but were customers billed incorrectly, and has that been fixed from a customer perspective?
So on the south, the one mentioned there was Southgate. That was actually something we found before the meter audit. That was found in a physical inspection in the field. Somebody noticed that there was, they had 5/8 inch meter rate, but there was 1 inch meters in the field, and that was a result of a CIP project that replaced all the services out there. And when those went in, they went in as 1 inch meters, and it turned out they were actually 5/8 meter. They were billed for the 5/8 inch meter, and that was something that had been carried on the books since that time, which was 1995, I think, is when that was done.
So was it?
So that's been
corrected?
corrected, but not, I mean, that ended up being back bills to the customers to correct that.
Say it again?
There was back bills to the customers to correct.
So they had underpaid? Or?
Well, it's a little bit complicated. As far as the water, the amount of water they used was the same, because the meters just measure how much, cubic feet of water. It doesn't matter what meter size it is, but in the last couple of years, we've added more fixed charges to the water utility meter rate. So in the last couple of years, that rate has escalated a lot. And now there's a pretty large difference between a 5/8 meter and a 1 inch meter for their fixed charge. Is about $15 difference. And that's just happened in the last couple of years. Previous to that, at times there was no difference, or maybe it was $1 or something between them. So that really became pronounced in the last couple of years. And then that's what impacted the customers, is because of this. In recent time is because we found them right after this period where we increased the fixed charges by a large amount, and so it impacted customers in back billing, because we had to back bill them for I think a year or so. We back billed them.
Okay. And this kind of last general question for Harriet. I mean, given the size of utilities in general, I mean, do you feel like it demands like more audit attention? Maybe do you have enough staff dedicated to utilities in general?
I can't speak about their staffing, but I would say that.
No, I meant your staffing. In terms
our
of,
staff.
In terms of auditing utilities, it's a major chunk of the city, right?
Correct. Well, we have one auditor dedicated to utilities.
Okay.
So, but as far as, how important it is, I think when we look at it, we think about really from a customer perspective. If you're the one who gets that inaccurate bill, and there was more, we did, as Tom said, identify that Southgate error in the audit, and the primary reason for putting that in was to show how long an error can go before it's detected and how that becomes a cumulative impact on the customer. In this case, it was an average bill of about $440 to customers who weren't expecting that back bill. And we did identify other examples. It wasn't just the Southgate example. There were other examples. But when we do an audit, we really try and put one or two examples in to show that there's an issue and not list every single example. We're not trying to just say, and then you did this, and then you did that. We really just want to say, here's a problem that we think you need to fix, and we can offer them copies of our work papers that show where the other examples are if they would like that.
Okay, thank you.
Mark?
So how did this audit, and it might have been in here and I missed it, but how did the audit get on the auditor's office's radar?
Before I was here, when they did the staff did the inventory management audit, they identified some problems with utility meters inventory, and so then they added it to the audit work plan, and it carried over into.
Okay, so the follow on from that audit.
They actually started this audit before I came here.
Yeah, thanks. So correct me if I'm misinterpreting something, because this is dense material. I'm not entirely understanding the Utilities Department's response to some of the auditor's findings. And so let's start with finding number 1, where the Utilities Department has not established adequate processes and procedures for organizing and setting up meters in SAP, causing data discrepancies and errors. And from what I can tell, a lot of the Utilities Department's response has to do with retaining the current system of performance-based specs is the most efficient way to specify and order meters. So specifying and ordering meters, but not necessarily organizing and setting them up. And I don't know if maybe that's a difference without a distinction, or it seems like there's two different times in the process. There's purchasing them, and then there's setting them up, organizing them, and tracking them.
Okay, well, I'll try to address. So on the issue of the meters and purchasing the meters and the specifications, so we're continuing to use the same specifications that we have. What we are doing is working with purchasing to make sure that they have the right, so they assign a material number to each meter. So we want to make sure that they have the right material number assigned to the correct meter. The specifications, as you mentioned, are general specifications. They cover all the meters. We don't write a specification for every single meter, because every electric meter basically has all the same functions in it. The difference in them is sort of what the back of the meter looks like and what socket it plugs into. So what we've done with purchasing is we've gone through and tried to align those so they know exactly what meter plug goes with what meter material number, so they can order their correct meters. And we've done that with all the meters, and we've gone through all the lists and make sure the list is clean, and that the list in SAP now is just the meters that we're ordering. That being said, everything that's been in there in the past still has to remain in there, because they're in the field and they have to be retired, so we can't take them out. But we've cleaned up so that the list we're ordering off of is a clean list of just the things we ordered today.
But what about that issue of the badge number and making sure that they all have the right badge number and meter type?
There's a number of things that have happened over the years with
material number.
with badge numbers, but so those are assigned. I mean, I'll explain it this way. I mean, like electric meter, they all have serial numbers on them, but when they come to the city, we assign a separate badge number for the electric meter, and so we usually that's stamped on by the manufacturer inside the meter glass, and essentially the way it was done in the past is the meter shop would just pick a range of numbers, they give it to the manufacturer, and then they'd stamp those numbers on the meter. And so I think what happened is over the years they were doing sort of a manual process, and they wouldn't always pick them in sequence necessarily when they stamped them, but they all got stamped, with the exception of a group of meters that somebody bought outside of the normal process from the manufacturer. They bought a used set of meters they picked up for $1 a piece. Well, those didn't come with the badge numbers on, so those had to be affixed manually on the meters after we got them.
And the audit had recommendations for better ways for the ordering of the badge numbers.
So I think we're
understanding
just
it
going to let
correctly.
SAP assign the badge numbers going forward, so we've agreed to do that.
Okay.
You see, so it's going to assign the numbers, and then you still got to tell the metering manufacturer what numbers to affix to the meter, and that's going to be the purchasing department telling the meter manufacturer what numbers to affix on the meter when they send them.
Okay, and let me now ask the auditor, does having SAP assign the badge numbers, does that satisfy the concerns that you guys had?
Yes, that's actually what we recommended.
Got it. Perfect. Is this, I should have looked back at a previous audit. Is this normally how we, for some reason, it used to be, I thought it was more easily, one was more easily able to follow recommendation, auditors, or department's response than the kind of free-flowing letter that we've got. Am I wrong in remembering that, or am I missing something?
I think the matrix is what you want, that is an attachment to the cover letter. Now, in the packet, that begins on page
I see.
50.
So I didn't get to the matrix. I was too busy looking at the letter. Got it.
And I just might single out, since you're seeing the matrix, maybe that helps, that auditor recommendation 1.2 is the one in particular that I see, of course, where utilities partially agrees, does not wholly agree. So I do think you will want to get some clarification and understanding what the nature of that partial agreement or disagreement is about. I have to imagine that the auditor still has concerns that that's only a partial agreement.
Well, so then, rather than me trying to interpret it, why don't I just ask, what is the partial disagreement about, and what?
I believe that was the issue that Tom just addressed. There didn't seem to be a clear understanding early in the process about what purchasing really needed, and utilities was very focused on the performance-based specs. But I think since they've had those meetings with each other, that they've clarified that issue.
Yeah, I think the disagreement, and like I say, I think it's been resolved. I'm not disagreeing with that. I think when we write the specs, it was sort of the recommendation, you need to write a specification for every type of meter that you have, and that's just not practical for the number of meters we have. So the way we handled it was a little bit differently in that we wrote the general specification, but then we sat down with purchasing to make sure they understood what it was they needed to be ordering on any particular material number. So that's how we addressed it.
So on packet page 56, in the answer to finding number 2, the Utilities Department mentions that there are exception logs that are generated daily, and wherever the reading is not deemed reasonable, a follow-up reading or meter investigation is requested, and that there were, what's the follow-up read or customer service, and there were between 150,000 and 200,000 of these reads, which is 17 to 23% of the total reads are I guess reread, reinvestigated because they're initially deemed unreasonable. How time intensive is that? I mean, how much time are we spending, and then how much money are we spending re-reviewing about a fifth to a quarter of the reads that initially occur?
I may have Dave help me a little bit on this, but we have several people that every month, essentially what happens is before we send out the bills, there's we compare certain parameters to see if they fall within the parameters. So there's a number of things that would make something fall out of a parameter and need to be investigated. If somebody was gone for a month.
Sure.
So we compare to the previous month, we'll get a meter read that's out of line with the previous month. Well, somebody has to take a look at those and say, yeah, that makes sense, or it's been going on for several months. Do we need to go out and investigate the meter? So there's a group of people that essentially do that. Every month, we get a bunch of things that come out of the exception report. A lot of them get cleared relatively easily, but there's always going to be a few that require some investigation where, meter may not be working properly, or, I mean, there's a number of things that could happen that would cause us to do detailed investigations on meters. So it's sort of a standard process. I mean, every utility is going to be doing some exception reporting and comparison and doing that. I don't know if we're out of line with others. I mean, we're very careful with the meters. We check a lot of them. We could probably loosen the parameters and let more flow through, but we're always very concerned in getting the right bills to our customers. It's always harder to correct them once they go out.
Real quick, I just want to add one thing. So Dave Yun, Senior Management Analyst. So I actually did a stint in customer service for like a year. And so a lot of the reads are because of zero consumptions, and either because they're vacant or they're doing, people are on vacation. And then the other reads are because they're too high, and that's when we send out the investigations, the too high or too low reads. So we do have like 3 dedicated staff members in the customer service team that do review these on a daily basis. And most of them, like Tom says, they do get cleared right away. The only ones we look for patterns, and sometimes seasonal. So during the summertime, your gas is gonna go up, and compares it to last year's season. And if there's a little, like 10% spike, then I'll flag it for us to check or not.
Okay.
So then we use our best judgment.
But so we have 3 staff that are dedicated to reviewing these full-time?
Yes, correct.
Okay. I mean, I guess I'd be curious to know if, we'll say average was 20%, 17% of 23%, so 20%. I'd be curious to know if 20% spiking or falling outside of that 10% range, if that is normal and acceptable, for the industry, or if that's high. And if it's high, then, be curious to know why, because it seems like,
Right.
3 staff.
Right, these staff, besides looking at the meter reads, they also take care of all the billing, adjustments, and invoicing. So they have other functions as well besides.
Okay. The billing and invoices for the exceptions or for all?
Everything.
Okay.
All the
So it isn't just 100% of their time spent on.
Correct.
Got it. Yeah.
Corey?
So it looks like only 2 of the recommendations have any even partial disagreement from utilities and from the city manager's staff, those being 1.2, which is on page 50 of our packet, and also 2.3 on page 52 of the packet. I'd like to hear the city auditor's thoughts on whether those are, I guess we talked a little bit about 1.2. I'd like to just hear clarity from the city auditor about how she feels about the progress and status of that, as well as 2.3, finding to recommendation 3, the response and the status of that. That kind of goes back to the question of, is it worth it to implement that recommendation, right? And based on your conversations and meetings since this packet was put together, I'd just be curious to hear City Auditor Richardson's thoughts on those 2 in particular, because those seem to be the only sticking points, unless I'm missing something and there are other sticking points beyond those 2.
So 1.2 we talked about, where they have now met with ASD and reached agreement on that. I think if they responded to that now, they would probably be changing their response from partially agree to agree. That's my take on that. On 2.3, so I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding on how much we're expecting them to do. An example is use the SAP process to automatically assign badge numbers. That's a capability that already exists. It doesn't require a lot of extra effort to use that capability, and those are the types of things that we're referring to. There's some things where you can automatically do things. SAP has the capability. We're not talking about reprogramming or doing anything that would be a cost, have a high cost to it. So we're really talking about taking advantage of the existing capabilities in SAP.
And does the city manager or Assistant Director Marshall have any response to those comments or further thoughts on
Tom may speak, but
2.3.
also Assistant Director from ASD, David Rainbert.
Yeah, hi,
Thank
my
you.
name's David Ramberg, Assistant Director of Administrative Services Department. We have, to echo what Harriet said, we have looked to the capabilities of SAP, and we concur absolutely that SAP can generate the badge numbers for us. And so as part of the purchasing process, once we've received complete information from the Utilities Department, we will ask SAP to generate a badge number, and that will go along with the order to the vendor. So the vendor will then have the opportunity to mark the badge number on the unit that comes then back to the city.
And
Thank you.
so I'll just comment. I mean, so one of the issues, as I mentioned before, is especially in the retirement process for meters, it's a very complicated process, and there's a lot of pieces of it that should be tied together that are not, which allows the person entering the data to put in wrong data when essentially the system probably should be stopping if it was integrated in a way that it was looking at, making sure the data makes sense as it gets entered. And that is one of the places where we see errors come in the system, and to correct those is not insignificant. So, I mean, from our standpoint, from the recommendation, I mean, that's an area of concern. We know that that's an area where data inconsistencies get in the system. But to fix that is not going to be inexpensive. And like I say, we've tried to address that through more training to make sure our employees are well trained and understand what happens when they do this work, that they check their work and make sure it's done properly. But to fix that is going to be fairly an expensive process for SAP to do that.
Right, and
Can I add something to that?
Please.
This comment? So I think one of the things that's really important to think about, what Tom is saying is absolutely true. And when you set up a new system, SAP is a very complex system, and I don't think when it was initially set up, everyone really had a full understanding of those complexities. And I think that's part of the reason now that our CIO is looking at some other options, in part also because we're losing support for SAP. But I think it's really critical that when they come to council with new options, with future options for what direction the city's going to go with its ERP system, that the council think about what is really needed to make sure it's implemented correctly at the beginning, that we're taking full advantage of where one of the complications with SAP is you have all these tables, and it could have been set up where you put information in one table and it automatically feeds into another table, but that wasn't necessarily what happened, and so you have to enter information more than once, which increases the chance for error. And so I think really moving forward, it's a really important thing to think about as we talk about a new system.
So when we get to the point of moving this forward and sending this to council, I mean, given the status of the audit, the response, the meeting since then, our conversation this evening, is there any strong hesitation from either utilities, city manager, or from the city auditor, any hesitance about sending this to the full council for approval? Or do you think there's anything that would cause us to want to delay?
I'm okay with it going forward. I think that the actions that are being taken are trying to move it forward. If for the new council members, there is a follow-up process, and that process is different than it used to be. So now the departments are going to be required to report back to Policy and Services every 6 months after the council approves it. So you'll be hearing on the status of what they've done directly. So I think moving forward with getting it approved will help get action started on implementing recommendations.
Thank you. And, city manager?
No, I'll wait to your question.
Oh, I was just going to say, and at least speaking for myself, I would understand if we are looking at other options other than the current system that we're using. I would understand wanting to hold off on doing a lot of work to bring the existing system up to speed, and a lot of, clearing up old backlogs if it's time to just move on to a new system, if that's happening. So I guess I can trust you guys to work together on where we prioritize.
Thank you, Councilmember. Well, actually, that was a realm of what my comments were going to be, which is, I think that, given the reminder that Harriet put out that we will have a 6-month updating process, I think we can measure the tempo of the change that we're implementing. That said, I think we're clear about the agreement about what needs to be done, and combined with that reporting requirement, anything we would decide to do with SAP, if that is to migrate to a new ERP, is going to be a multi-year process. So, I sort of feel that we ought to be staying the course in the response, essentially with the auditor's recommendations, understanding that even if we were to, once we work through the decision-making process, and we would ultimately select somebody, it's going to be several years before we would be onto a new system.
And I just want to add one other thing. One of the other initiatives we're looking for right now is a smart meter initiative for the gas, water, and electric meters. When we implement that system, we're going to have to do a whole-scale replacement of meters at that time. And I mean, at that point, it's going to make sense for us to get these processes down, but it's going to have to be very organized, because we're going to essentially go through and replace everything. And the other point of that is a lot of the inventory and other things some of these issues we're having today will go away, because the meters will be self-reporting. We'll know what meter it is. We'll know what its ID number is, what type of meter it is. That'll all be reporting in through the smart meter system. So the system will be a lot smarter, and we should get rid of a lot of these problems we see today. And we're looking at probably in the 3 to 5 year window for.
Tom has a follow-on question.
It's related to this idea of checking in 6 months. It looked like most of the corrections were targeted by June. And just as a practical matter, if council members are on this committee for a year, if it's a 6-month follow-up, there's a good chance that a different group of people will hear the follow-up. So I don't know if it's practical to adjust that frequency to when the fixes actually come in place. And maybe that's not appropriate to this discussion, but it just seems like a practical matter. It'd be great if we hear the original audit and a lot of things were fixed by June, that it would come back to us sooner. Otherwise, it seems, more than half the things would hit a different group of policy and service folks.
Harriet, have you given any thought to that?
I think that I would encourage departments, if they've implemented the recommendations sooner, to come back sooner and just clear it off the books. The 6 months is, assuming that some recommendations are going to take longer than that to say this is where we are at this point. But I think anything that's cleared off, if they're going to be able to do most of it sooner, that they could come back sooner.
But I think it begs a question as to whether under this new response cycle time, whether there should be any effort to align the audits and the responses so that a given committee will be able to go through one of those cycles, so that in theory, if we had the audits come forward in the first half of the year and the responses in the second, then the same committee would have continuity in that process. I don't know whether that works with kind of how the audits come forward, because you have a plan that doesn't necessarily allow you to have them all in the first 6 months. So any thoughts on that?
I think we'd have to go back and change the ordinance again, but we could definitely look at whether or not we want to do some different type of process, and I'm open to discussing that.
Yeah, maybe if you and the city manager could both look at how that cycle would work going forward under this new program.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Corey? Okay, so I still have a few things that have been touched on that I'm not quite clear on. On recommendation 1.2, Tom had spoken about a difference between engineering specs and other descriptions that as the basis for why why it wouldn't be practical to have an engineering spec for each device, correct? And,
Correct.
and Harriet, what are your thoughts on that response?
So we had told utilities that we weren't expecting them to write a different spec for each type of device. What we were saying is you can continue with your performance-based specifications, but if you need to add some additional information to help ASD purchasing understand what they needed to purchase, that's really what we were after. So I think they accomplished that in a different way, but we weren't ever asking for them to write a whole bunch more different specs.
Okay, so it seems like the issue is around the term engineering specs, and it's a term of art within the utilities department on this that means greater detail than what you had intended in your finding. So now with the clarification that Harriet has made as to what's acceptable to achieve the end that the auditor is hoping we will have, does the utilities department agree with that clarified request?
Yes.
Okay, good. Check. And then under 2.3, the findings spoke about ensuring the meter descriptions carry through the procurement to retirement. And Tom, your response was about the inefficiency of the retirement process under our current SAP. And I'm trying to understand how that inefficiency, given that it is the case, how that affects that the meter descriptions carrying through from procurement to retirement. So I'm not following that.
Okay, so I'll do my best. Maybe Harry can jump in here too. But there's a couple places in SAP where the meters are described, actually. There's a meter material number that has a description of the meter, and I believe there's a separate meter description that goes into the utility billing module. And I think what they're pointing out, because those are entered separately from each other, that sometimes those don't match up. And that's sort of another one of these inefficiencies where SAP should be talking between modules so that the data gets carried forward. But it's something that we deal with every day and on the entry process.
And is there some sort of a item number or part number that tracks with the description?
There is. In the materials module, there is. But there's a separate portion in there where the utility module and a different description gets installed there for the meters.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
You call it an item number or part number, or what do you call it?
Yeah, material number, I guess is what we typically call it.
So are we saying that we don't have a problem with material numbers maintaining consistency from procurement to retirement, but we do have a problem with descriptions varying of the same material number? Is that basically?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's sort of the problem. I mean, but the retirement process is a sort of it's multiple modules in SAP too, where you have the materials module where it gets bought out, and then it goes over to the utility module where it gets set in the field, and it has to be retired out of the field, and eventually it'll have to go to the assets portion of SAP and be fully retired. So it's sort of bouncing around different places in SAP as it moves from birth to death, I guess. And there's a lot of places in there where things can be entered that are not re-entered in a way that they don't match up. The descriptions don't end up matching up.
Harry, any thoughts?
Sure. Can I refer you to page 43 in your packet?
Great.
And this actually is an example describing exactly that. So the master material number is 028000, but you'll see that the device category description is different than the material description in two different places. And then if you go down below and you see where they tried to correct that, they still ended up with some differing descriptions throughout. And so when it doesn't match all the way through, you're not always sure that you're matching up the same, that it's the same meter.
Okay, so thank you. When we have this kind of circumstance, like we see on packet page 43, first, what level of consequence occurs as a result of that? So if we're saying with our current SAP system, this is a difficult thing to resolve, we can do better training and reduce it, but probably we're going to have still a fair amount of a problem. What's the consequence of this error?
It's hard to know what meters you have and what types of meters you have where when the descriptions don't always match up. And when you have those types of problems, then you can't necessarily account for everything the way you need to. In the first examples where you have different types of meters, the sizes came out the same, and so I don't believe it affected billing. It's more of a record keeping to making sure, for example, if you want to replace certain types of meters, that you're getting the types of meters replaced that you need to be replacing.
But when they're, maybe this is more of a question for Tom, when we replace the meters, do we replace them based on description or material number?
Well, when we
both.
replace, well, there's different ways, but one of the things we have is the badge numbers are in some sequential order, and we can go back to see when the meter was purchased based on the badge number. So we may not rely on SAP to pull that information, because we can get that information from the manufacturer, or we can get serial numbers. So when we're doing a program, we're probably not going to be relying on SAP to figure out what meters to be replaced. We're going to be looking at what records that we have on hand. Typically, I mean, we're not going out and replacing meters en masse. Typically, they're replaced either when they're not reading accurately, or we know there's a problem with a particular meter. We're not typically going out and replacing all one class of meter. It's just not practical. And the other point of that is, I mean, we really run them to the point where they're not reading accurately, and that's the time we replace them. We see something showing up on the billing record or some indication that it's not reading accurately anymore, then we go out and replace it.
Well, that begs a different question. Before following up on that one, so Harriet, given what Tom just described, what remaining problems do you see?
If they aren't using this information, it's probably not that significant.
Okay. And this isn't in part of the findings, but what you just described about how the meters are retired when they appear to stop working right. And I don't know if there's any other method, but that sounds problematic. It means that after failures become apparent, that's the only trigger that we have for replacement?
Well, I mean, there's certain numbers that we do based on, we do some meters based on the badge number and the dates. So we do that. And a lot of those badge numbers are manually recorded, because a lot of these meters are really old. They were done, some of them were done before computers were around. So they keep those records, and we have some idea of about when the meter was purchased. And that's one of the criticisms the auditor had, was at some point these numbers got a little bit out of sequence, and so there was some, do you really know when that meter was placed? And the answer is they probably do, because they can go back and look to see when the numbers were assigned, so they know when the dates were written.
These meters, by their nature, don't have the ability to have a calibration test? You go out and just do a test and say, is it within this % accuracy or not?
You can't do that in the field. You have to actually physically go out and remove the meters and bring them back in. So, I mean, you can imagine if you have 70,000 meters, you do a certain percentage, but you're not going to go out and do this in mass. Especially water meters, you got to get down into the box, you got to unbolt it, and you have to take it out, and you have to put another one in. So,
okay, I get it. Wish there was a better, but yes.
So good evening, council members. My name is Dean Batchelor. I'm the assistant director sitting in the engineering group. So to answer maybe a little bit clearer is that we follow standards that are set by the WWA, which is the Water Association, and there's also set ones for gas as well. And then usually the typical time frame is usually around 17 to 20 years. So as Tom was mentioning, as these badge numbers that we use, we go back and we know when those badge numbers were actually put into the field portion of it. So what we will typically do is that we'll look at that time range and then those dates, and then we actually go out and we change those meters. So before they get to be a problematic little problem. And then as Tom mentioned is that we can't test those meters in the field at all. So we replace it with a brand new meter at that period of time. A new badge number gets attached to it. And that's usually how we track it from an operational standpoint. We don't really go into SAP and use that number.
Okay, so you're on a preventative basis taking them offline prior to the anticipated effective retirement of the meters. So when you take those out, so it's 17 to 20 years anticipated life, and you take them out at how many years then?
We usually take them out right to around 17 years. Life expectancy timeframes between 17 and 20.
Okay. So when you take a meter out at 17 years, do we, on some sort of sampling basis, do a determination of the reliability of the meters at 17 years to know, are they 99% reliable, 90, 50?
At that period of time, what we do is we do test every meter that we take out. And so we know exactly, because it goes back to when we were talking about keeping a meter for 30 days. The customer has a right to look at those reads and to see what their meter is. But we keep it to 45 days before we discard it. So again, just to give the customer that little bit extra time frame. So we do look at that, and we do test every meter that goes out within that process.
And do you have statistics on the frequency that they're out of spec at that time that you pull them?
We do. We keep on a yearly record base that we keep internally.
Any approximation as to the reliability percentage?
You know, we find them pretty much at the point of, on the water meter sides, we look at them where they're right about 91% within that period of time. Gas meters that we find a little bit lower in that aspect, and it's about 86%.
And what I'm leading toward is, based on those percentages, what would be the cost and the benefit, either to the ratepayer or to us, of, say, pulling them at 15 years and driving that up past 95% or those kinds of things? Is that something that we've examined, and is there a cost benefit, either to us or the ratepayer, or both?
I think probably most likely to us, because as we can find is that, you know, I can't honestly sit here and tell you that we've looked at that and find out where the breaking point is, that at 12 years, that's the time that when it really drops to maybe 99%, or, you know, what that timeline is. But yes, whatever that timeline would be, it would be a benefit to us, because as we see, as I mentioned earlier, you get into that 90 and that 80%, we're losing 10 to anywhere to 15%.
Well, do you think it'd be worth doing a pilot sampling, enough that would be statistically significant to look at an earlier cycle and the labor that's involved versus the benefit that we would derive?
I guess we could. I guess the concern that I would have, maybe if you're asking me, one is that as we move forward with these water meters, and then what we're seeing is as Tom mentioned earlier, is that, you know, right now we're paying around $50 for a meter. That meter jump is going to jump up to about $230 to $270. So, but I guess, you know, we could find out where the break-even point is and take a look at it from.
I'm sorry, is that the smart meters are going to go to that price? Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, and I think the other thing is that at least on water, we're moving to we've already made the move to electronic water meters. So those have a whole different life cycle from the ones we have today. So hopefully, you know, those will be more accurate up through the life, but we're only expecting those to last, I think, 15 to 17 years because of the battery in them.
So whatever is that new anticipated lifespan, I would just think that there would be a value in knowing if you know, it may not carry over to this 91 and 86%, but 91 and 86% reliability at the time we remove them sound like actually a low performance number. And I don't know what that cost benefit would be if you say removed it 2 years earlier and it cost a certain amount to do that cycle earlier but whatever that benefit would be. And it doesn't sound like we have that number.
Right.
These are big dollars.
We're talking about accuracy, I guess, of the meter. I think we're talking instead of being, and we could talk a little bit about that. I mean, no meters have an accuracy curve, so it's not actually accurate 100% across the range of all flow. So at some point it begins decreasing, and so we would need to take a look, sort of, where's the water usage, and how accurate is the point where the typical water usage. But we could take a look at that, and it does make some sense to do an analysis
And
around
I'd
that.
suggest that on the water side, that as that's the commodity that's having a great increase, that what might have been the cost benefit 5 years ago would be a higher benefit today to assuring that the meters are accurate than it might have been there. And so your calculus maybe now have been changing in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. David, I just want to check, you'd responded to this issue on the kind of control automation. Are there any other issues related to the audit where we have an ASD role and the Utilities Department role where you would like to see any additional changes? Or are you fully comfortable with the responses from ASD's perspective?
Yes, I am fully comfortable with the responses from ASD's perspective. We think the audit's been beneficial, and we've identified the areas that we agree with, and there's no areas that we don't agree with in terms of the recommendations. The two bottom recommendations, I think it's 3.2 and 3.3, have to do with one of the steps we haven't really talked about here tonight in detail, and it's probably more of a minor area, but has to do with the retiring of the end point of the retirement process and how that translates into the city financial records in terms of fully depreciating retired meters. So that's a piece of the process that the audit identified as needing to be more in sync. And so we agree with that, and we are putting in place steps and new processes to sync up with utilities more thoroughly with their list of retired meters with what our records in SAP, so that the final financial records that ultimately translate into a gross number in the CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, is accurate all the way through. So we have some tightening up that we think is beneficial in that process. And we also think that the ordering process that we have talked about tonight has been tightened up as well. We're implementing a new technology solution, which we're pretty pleased with too, we've implemented DocuSign here in the city, which is a digital signature technology, but it's also really a web-based workflow tool. So these documents, what used to be paper documents, are now flowing through these different people, and they're tracked, and DocuSign is our ultimate repository, and they have an unlimited storage capability for us. So long-term, we think this is a good solution, and it's working well for us. People coming up to speed on this new tool. It's sort of like, you guys don't see MinuteTrack, but it's sort of like MinuteTrack for all kinds of other documents.
And
so
when did that get implemented?
we implemented DocuSign first in the purchasing division in 2013, and other departments have started to use it for their needs as well. So this is one of those new uses.
And so that just is now getting implemented here just recently?
Yeah, in the past, probably late part of 2014, we started using it for the recommendations here in this audit.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I wanted to just touch base again on this thing that came up on the Southgate meters. That was 20 years ago, but a question I have is the audit did about 15%, first the audit didn't detect this. It was an example use, correct?
What, excuse me?
The meters in Southgate, the problem there?
The problem, we discovered that before the audit.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
But Harriet mentioned, I think, that there were some other examples that they had identified. So what I'm trying to understand is, was the Southgate example a single exception? Harriet says not. Maybe it was the most significant. But there were several others that were identified, and then the audit only looked at like 15% of the meters, I think. It was 11,000 out of 70-something thousand. So I'm trying to understand how more widespread that problem could be, or are we convinced that level of problem is anomalous?
Well, I'll just explain it this way. What happened in Southgate was a one-off thing. It had to do with a CIP project. That does not mean that there are not other errors in the records, because they certainly could be from a variety of reasons over a number of years that people have entered wrong items into the record. And that's something that we regularly do. We have one person on staff that tries to track down these discrepancies between what we find in the meters and what's out in the field. In this particular one, like the Southgate, the only way that got discovered was somebody physically had to observe that in the field. You could not tell that problem from the data in SAP. That was something you had to physically see in the field. But there are other errors in the billing record. We know that they're out there. At this point, we don't think they're widespread across it, but we know that there are other errors out there that need to be corrected.
Okay. Harriet, any thoughts on that?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using some of this information that we have from this audit to quantify during the next audit. We do have some examples of others, and we'll be looking at trying to find out how widespread it is. When we do that audit, we will be trying to do a statistically valid sample, and so we'll be doing a lot of field work, going out and actually looking at meters and being able to try and see if there's discrepancies.
Okay. And in this report that we received tonight, we've talked about a couple places where there's been additional resolution between the staff response and the auditor's perspective. When this goes to council, will this be updated to reflect some of those clarifications we heard tonight? Yes. Good.
Okay.
Okay. Unless anybody else has questions, we'd be ready to entertain a motion. Okay, I'm entertaining. I'll move the, I took the cover page. I'll move that the utility meter audit, thank you, that the Policy and Services Committee recommends to the City Council acceptance of the utility meter audit.
Second.
All right. I have no discussion. Mark? Anyone else have discussion? Please vote. Thank you. And maybe the lights aren't on. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you to everyone for all the work that's gone into this, and hopefully all the improvements that continue to come about as a result. Thanks. Okay, thanks.
Should we take a 5 before we move on to the next one?
We can if you need one.
Mark's good enough. I'd like to stretch my
All right.
legs.
We're going to take a 5-minute break.
by the riverside, Richard Thompson on, and the day so fine, in Pennsylvania towns sort of slip right by in a soft line south under purple skies. I was driving home through the Sunday bells, through the trailer town, still shines, and the streams run down the mountainside. Slow down, what's the hurry? There's no rush today. There won't be too many days like today. I was driving home on the black-top tar, up and down this road like a cartoon car. Mason-Dixon line slips behind me now. Golden fields go by, golden sun goes down. Slow down, what's the hurry? There's no rush today. There won't be too many days like today. Driving home. Driving home.
Convening. And our next item is agenda item number 2, which is to recommend adoption of revisions to the Green Building Ordinance and the Energy Code Ordinance. Welcome. Peter, would you like to begin? Oh.
Good evening, Council. Happy to be here. Thank you for taking the time to hear us through. We've been hard at work at this, and we're excited to bring it before you today. Just by way of introduction, I'm Peter Perniciad, the Development Services Director. We have before you tonight Farhad Farhamand from TRC, the consultant that prepared the cost-effectiveness study that we're going to be referencing tonight. Melanie Jacobson is our Green Building Coordinator contractor. She's been instrumental in creating all of the web-facing pieces, a lot of the organization behind the Green Building Ordinance, facilitating collaboration with our stakeholders in the community, etc. George Hoyt is our Chief Building Official here today, also to answer any technical questions around this being a Title 24 building code. Gil Friend, our Sustainability Officer here, can really speak to, and we'll give him an opportunity to talk to how this effort collaborates and kind of parallels the work that he's doing in sustainability with the climate action plan, the sustainability action plan, and how we've been partnering with him this entire time to make sure that his vision is reflected in this document to be consistent with the forward-facing and real progressive stance that the city has taken towards sustainability as a whole, and he can speak to that. Shiva from our Utilities Department is also here to speak to the level of collaboration with other departments, including utilities, that we've had up until this point since we began this process over a year ago. He was involved in many of the meetings that we've had up to this point, as well as the day-long retreat that we had at Mitchell Park Library, where we, or the art facility, where we had members of the entire Green Building Advisory Group, as well as expert facilitators present. So Also, we have Judith Wasserman here from the Green Building Advisory Group and a very involved member of the community, as well as the DCAG and the Green Building Advisory Group, and been a very trusted colleague that we've gone to many times on many occasions to solicit feedback. I wanted to thank the Policy and Services Committee again for hearing this item, the Green Building Advisory Group for meeting with us relentlessly over the last year and hammering through the very complicated process of dealing with buildings, which are a complicated system in a whole, and to identify the green building measures is no easy task. And then finally, staff, who's been also working hard at trying to make sure that we try to make sense and simple a very complicated system of measures and means. As far as framing, just to start the conversation, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what led up to this. This has really been a partnership, a collaboration with the community that we started back in 2013, where we elicited responses and participation from architects, from experts, and other stakeholders in the community. We've collaborated with other departments, including utilities, public works, Gil Friend, and the sustainability group. It's been very involved in engaging with the community, soliciting feedback the entire time. The process has really been a journey that really ended and culminated in what we did in August, which was a green building retreat where we went away for a whole day. We brought experts in the energy field, in the green building field. We had expert facilitators that ran the entire meeting and visual facilitators that took copious notes and artistically rendered the meeting to help frame what we talked about, and I'll be reviewing that as well. It is a progressive ordinance. It is very forward-facing. It's ahead of other cities, and we don't shy away from that. That's what we were called to do, and it does achieve that. But luckily, we have the right staff at the helm to make sure that we're not going off track. Farhad from TRC is actually on the board, on the group of consultants that are formulating the next code cycle for the Energy Commission. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, this is not a dictatorship, it's a partnership. And it doesn't stop today, it starts today. And we intend to have ongoing conversations and training, workshops. In fact, we'll be talking a little bit about this later. The website, which we've just launched today, is just the starting point of the level of engagement that we intend to maintain as we continue to not only partner with the architectural community in enforcing this code, but quickly we have to recalibrate forces and start working on the next code cycle, which is quickly coming. So with that, let me just quickly outline what we will be discussing today. This will be a partnership between myself and Melanie. I will be really talking about the high-level aspects and then turn to Melanie for more of the details. The scope of the Green Building and Energy Code Ordinance, which we'll review today in its entirety, it's made up of two parts. It's the Green Building and the Energy Code. And the reason that they're two different sections is that they're two different codes. And so we couldn't do one giant Green Building ordinance. It was Energy and Green Building separate. The background on the green building and the energy policy in Palo Alto, will walk through that quickly. And then I'll pass it along to Melanie, and she'll talk about the Energy Reach Code ordinance and the proposed changes, as well as the Green Building Code ordinance and the proposed changes. And then finally, we'll include the Green Building Advisory Group's additional revisions. So since we pushed out the draft of this ordinance, we quickly pushed it out to the Green Building Advisory Group and solicited feedback, met with them twice since we had the draft ordinance, and today we're before you to hear any additional comments that we might have from them. But we've also absorbed those comments into the document. At this point, they are bullet points in this PowerPoint presentation. We'll be quickly going back to the City Attorney's Office to dial them into the actual ordinance language, which will come before the entire City Council, our hope, on Earth Day on April 20th. So the two codes that I mentioned are the Green Building Ordinance, which is Part 11 of Title 24, and the Energy Code Ordinance, which is Part 6 of Title 24. The Green Building Ordinance looks at site design, water efficiency, materials, air quality, that kind of thing, whereas the energy code strictly looks at energy efficiency, and that's it. And when people talk about Title 24, they typically, or people think of energy efficiency, lighting, that sort of thing. So by way of background, the history of the green building and the energy ordinance, we have been a model in this arena since 2008. When California first came out with Cal Green, their version of a green building code, it was a voluntary ordinance at that time. And in 2008, we mandated that voluntary ordinance. We took it on. And based on that, we've been building upon that. And ever since that first ordinance, we've always had what we call a REACH code, which is requiring energy efficiency beyond the minimum Title 24 energy code requirements. So ever since the beginning, we've required a significant percentage above that, and we've been a model city ever since then. And today, we come before you with the same type of proposal, reaching yet further, even further. The trick is that every code cycle, which happens every 3 years, they progressively get more restrictive. The energy code gets more restrictive, and yet again, we come back with a REACH code that raises the bar yet again. So the Green Building Advisory Group, which we gave the acronym GBAG, has been a year-long vetting effort to identify appropriate direction. This has really been a policy-level effort where we've asked for leadership in the area of air quality, water efficiency, indoor air quality, et cetera, landscaping. And they've been giving us great feedback and direction on not only how progressive we want to be or where we want to draw ourselves as far as leaders in that area, but also when, because we can't effectively do everything today. We decided which items we would do in this code cycle versus the following code cycle. A lot of this is in parallel with a lot of the city efforts that are underway, which is another slide that I'll get into. We've been having monthly meetings roughly since 2013 when we started this effort. And those meetings have all been categorized and agendized in minutes, and they're available on our website. And that's been sort of the area where we've kept all of these materials. And then, like I mentioned, that culminated in a day-long retreat in August of last year, where we went off-site and brought in facilitators to help us work through that entire complicated process of all the different aspects of green building and energy efficiency. And finally, we come before you with a draft of a proposal, and that proposal includes a staff report with findings, a recommended energy ordinance, which you'll find as attachment A, a recommended green building ordinance, which you'll find as attachment B, and then to support that energy code ordinance, we've prepared a cost effectiveness study, which is included in attachment C. And the important note here is that technically you can't pass a green building ordinance without doing a cost effectiveness study. The California Energy Commission requires this, and in order for it to be defensible in court, you need to have a cost effectiveness study that basically measures the cost effectiveness of the measures you're exceeding Title 24 energy compliance by. So we went through it properly and orderly, and we had to go through the procurement process and the contractual process of getting that online, which took us some time, admittedly, set us back a little bit, but we quickly pulled together our resources, and now we come before you. So I just wanted to quickly go over the caliber of the people at that retreat. This wasn't just a hodgepodge of people that wanted to show up. We had Charles Ely. Charles is a veteran of the energy arena, 40 years of experience in the energy efficiency and sustainability design. Mr. Ely worked with the California Energy Commission to update the state energy efficiency standards for 5 code cycles. So that's 15 years just working with them specifically on every code cycle for 5 code cycles. So he's considered literally an expert, a leader, an innovator in this space, and he's probably the best person that we could have brought in the area of energy. We also brought in Bill Worthen. Bill Worthen served as a member of the San Francisco's Green Building Task Force, resulting in the city's pioneering green building ordinance, winner of the first World Green Building Council Government Leadership Award in 2011. And he was recently appointed by Mayor Ed Lee to the public seat on San Francisco's Municipal Green Building Task Force. So a force to be reckoned with in the area of green building and energy efficiency. And then we also had Melanie there, who has been working side by side with us at Development Services as a consultant to the city to assist in green building, policy development, building compliance, training, departmental coordination efforts with Development Services, and being an advocate and spokesperson for us with the community at large. And we also had Kate Rudder, a visual facilitator, that helped actually put all this together in a visual format that we were able to lean back on to remind us of what we did. And the next slide is an illustration of what that visual facilitation was. It's a really great overview of what we covered that full day. What we did with Bill Worthen's help was identify specific measures in each of these 5 areas: water efficiency, emissions, energy, materials and waste, and indoor air quality, and polled the group on where they wanted to be in terms of leadership. We didn't get into the weeds in terms of exactly what we wanted to do, but more rather, where did they want to be in terms of leadership in that area? And we did talk about exceeding Title 24. We talked about being more stringent in our water efficiency efforts, et cetera. At the same time, we kept true to the blueprint, which was to ensure that the process was easy, that we engaged in a partnership with the community to make sure that this wasn't a mandate that wasn't supported and explained well. So this slide is basically our vision of how this all comes together. Along the top axis, you'll notice the years. In bold, 2016, 2019, 2022, 2025 are the years that we will be having, the codes are going to be updated. 6 months later, we need to adopt those. So in 2017, we will need to adopt the 2016 code. In 2022, we'll need to adopt the previous code, et cetera. So they give us 6 months warning before we adopt their code. And in that 6 months, we should have already started our analysis, our cost effectiveness study, and other vetting processes so that we can bring that before the Policy and Services, then to the City Council the first, then the second time, and then take it to the Building Standards Commission. So it's a very long and rigorous process that we need to start well in advance of January when our codes need to take effect, which is why they give us 6 months lead time when those codes become effective. So what we've proposed is a multi-step process. The first step is before you today, which is basically establishing a leadership position in the area of energy efficiency and some additional measures in green building that really set us apart from other cities in areas that we as a group from the Green Building Advisory Group felt it was important enough to take additional steps beyond code towards. And it's important to note that with the help of Farhad, who's working with the California Energy Commission, the recommendations that we're putting before the council and this policy group are going to be part of the next energy code cycle that comes before you in 2016. So although it is progressive, the state is progressing at just a fast pitch. So we are ahead of the curve, but the curve is right behind us. And it's a tidal wave, and we're just staying basically one step ahead of it. After we move into step 2, which will be our goal at the next code cycle would be an entry into a zero net energy goal. Now the state has set a mandate, which you'll see here in 2020, of zero net energy for all residential development. And therefore, the next California Energy Commission update will probably be the zero net energy mandate for all new residential. We're being more aggressive than that, and we're targeting that in 2016 and not waiting for 2020. In 2030, the same thing happens for commercial. And so we're proposing to target that in advance of the 2030 goal by 2025. We could be more aggressive than that, but we're trying to give the community as well as the industry time to catch up so that we're not forcing measures that aren't attainable. Because not only do they need to be feasible, but they need to be cost effective. And so we're wanting to make sure that we're being responsible in the mandates that we're placing on our residents and our architectural community. Below this, the straight line, you'll see the comprehensive plan, the Sustainability Climate Action Plan, and electrification, which is what we're calling our fuel switching effort. And these are all initiatives that are in discussion or projects that are well underway, which align very nicely with the work that we're doing with the Green Building Ordinance. They dovetail in all the work that we're doing. So we've been in touch with Hillary, with Gil, and Val in these efforts. So with that, what I'd like to do is pass it on to Melanie to talk a little bit about the specific Energy Reach Code ordinance improvements that are, these are the new initiatives that we're asking with this ordinance. So with that, Melanie.
Great. Honorable Council, thank you so much for hearing this ordinance. So the slide you see before you outlines the Energy Reach Code ordinance improvements. And again, these are based on the cost effectiveness study that was performed by TRC, the consultant here with us. So the way the Energy Code works is that, as Peter mentioned, there's a baseline standard that every building needs to meet. And then you develop a REACH code by setting a standard of a certain percentage above the baseline case. So we entered into the cost effectiveness study by studying at what point does it become cost effective above the baseline minimum code to adopt a new construction ordinance that meets those criteria. And what we found in the cost effectiveness study and the recommendations that came from TRC was that at a 15% increase for new construction projects, that's single family, multifamily, and commercial, that target is met at 15%. So that's what is recommended in the ordinance that's before you for new construction. Now, in some areas, the target for cost effectiveness was even higher at 20%, but we decided to stay with 15% because that was the most prudent direction for all new construction. Now, for renovation projects will have two different options. They can either go what's called the performance method, which is what I described before in new construction, or prescriptive, which is really just a list of measures that need to be implemented. So for performance-based option, we're asking to increase the stringency over the statement requirements by 5% for single family, 10% for multifamily, and 5% for commercial. And again, those numbers came directly from the modeling results that were compiled. And then for option 2, it's meeting the list of cost-effective measures for roofs, walls, and lighting. And those were the measures that were explored in the cost-effectiveness study. In addition, the Green Building Advisory Group wanted to emphasize the solar-ready infrastructure requirements for new homes. So what we did study in the model was designated roof area increased from 500 square feet. So there's basically a dedicated solar zone on a new home dedicated for future installation should the homeowner wish to pursue that path. So it's really just creating the infrastructure and the conduit, the piping in case they need to put wiring up to the roof line. And we've also accounted for the electrical panel requirements that would need to be installed at the time of a new construction. We've also taken into account certain exceptions to make sure we're in line with both the Palo Alto Tree Ordinance and the Solar Shade Act of 2009, just to make sure that all of our policies are in sync in that regard. So, so moving on to the Green Building Ordinance, that was the Energy Ordinance. So for the Green Building Ordinance, the recommendation is to move towards using the residential CalGreen tiers level for CalGreen, which is the California Green Building Code. Currently, we use a outside certification program called Build It Green, and the recommendation is to move towards this code-based system, which essentially allows staff to enforce the code similar to how other building codes are enforced. So it makes Build It Green, the certification program, back to, moves it to a voluntary program, is how, and that's actually how it was originally designed to be used as a voluntary program. We're also recommending a laundry to landscape ready infrastructure, which is essentially a small valve that would go on the the laundry water output to allow a homeowner to easily convert to a laundry to landscape system, which is actually very low cost and doesn't even require a permit now in the state. In addition, we're recommending increased water efficiency measures. So essentially the same rigor we hold larger projects to, we're also going to ask that smaller projects, we're basically lowering the square footage threshold trigger to increase the savings from landscape design. So on the next slide outlines the proposed revisions from the Green Building Advisory Group that we've been working in partnership with them on for to outline the final version of this. And one thing that the group really was vocal in requesting was including an infeasibility exemption. This basically would allow staff to permit alternative measures where strict compliance is not feasible or cost effective. So we have similar guidelines for this in other parts of the building code, so we'd be borrowing that methodology. And really to create clear guidelines for where a project's infeasible, so we're not slowing down the permitting process and basically helping people get their permit in a timely manner. In addition, the recommendation is to lower the residential square footage threshold, which means that what the square footage at which the energy ordinance is triggered from 1,250 square feet to 1,000 square feet. And that will basically help the energy code align with the green building code. So it's the same square footage trigger. In addition, in the residential tier 1 and tier 2 requirements, there's been a request for clarification for the prerequisites that are associated with those tiers. So there are some, and the request has been to look, to examine those and make sure that we are moving forward with the prerequisites that are applicable to Palo Alto. So we'll be examining that in the final version of the ordinance. And in addition, the trainings and handouts that we've already begun to develop to help architects and engineers implement these measures on future design and construction projects. So we're going to be developing a new website that has soft launch today, forms and handouts to assist in the compliance process. So with that, we'll move to time for questions from the committee.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. We have one member of the public to speak, which is Judith Wasserman, who's a member of the CBAG committee. Maybe we'll let her speak first. Sounds fine. Judith, welcome.
Hello, this is my first Policy and Services Committee. Never done this before. So I'm an architect and a member of GBAG, and I want to start off by saying that the staff did a tremendous amount of work on this ordinance. It's very tricky, it's very complicated, and there are a lot of places where there's conflict between the green building and the energy people who don't, at the state level, don't seem to talk to each other. And I'll give you one example. It has to do with recirculating hot water. So here's your water heater, here's your shower. You turn on the hot water, you run the hot water for 2 minutes until it gets hot, and you waste a lot of water. Well, you can do a recirculation thing where the hot water is always ready, you don't waste the water, but you spend a little energy on your pump. Somebody needs to talk to those people, and that's the kind of thing that we've been trying to do, GBAG, with the staff, to get these two ordinances to coordinate better than the state seems to think that they do. So most of the problems have been addressed here. And I'm really glad to say that the staff really listened to us, and they said that they were going to address the most important issues, which were chiefly that the Tier 1 and Tier 2 requirements in the state ordinance are not the same as the Tier 1 and Tier 2 requirements in the city ordinance. The state ordinance is not feasible. You just can't meet it. And the staff recognized that that was the case, and they're going to fix it. And I'm really pleased that they have been able to do that. I was going to say a whole bunch of other stuff, but I think I will skip it and just say that this is a flawed document, but every document is a flawed document. And I would urge you to not get into the Palo Alto thing of making the perfect the enemy of the good.
We don't need that.
We are going to have to get this done and get it working so that we're going to have to keep fixing it. And, you know, there was that chart of every 3 years, we're going to have to play catch up. There's going to be a point where we can't beat the state. You know, zero energy is zero energy, and we're just going to have to stop. But until then, you know, it's not going to be easy to build. I'm just telling you, if you want to make changes in your building, you're going to have to meet a high standard. And I think that was the goal, but it's hard for us.
Great. Judith, I have one question. We had at our places a letter from one of the members of the committee, Tom Wagner.
Yes.
And he raised issues that seem to be different from what you're expressing. Are you familiar with those issues? Do you have any comments on them?
Yeah, I think Tom felt that that there should have been more DCAG meeting. That there was this hiatus between the time that we stopped meeting and the time that the ordinance was ready, and that, as Peter pointed out, had something to do with writing the contract to get the cost effectiveness study done. It was an administrative problem. But it did mean that once the ordinance was out, we didn't really have a lot of time to work on it. And Tom has some specific issues with Build It Green being left out of the, we used to use that as our standard in the city, and now we're not going to do it. And he thinks that there should be, that it should be allowed to be an alternate. I don't have any personal feelings about that. I generally think that the more choices you have, the easier things are. So if somebody wants to use Build It Green as an alternate, they should be able to do it. The way it's set up now, I believe you have to pay twice. You have to pay the city fees and the Build It Green fees if you want to use Build It Green.
And was that issue raised at that last committee, or is it meeting?
It was raised at the last meeting.
Okay.
And, you know, along with 40 other things, and it's hard to deal with everything
So
at
my
once.
question then is, in response to him raising that issue, was there any consensus by the committee on whether that should or should not be changed?
I wouldn't say there was a consensus. I mean, there were some people like me who didn't care one way or the other. Tom felt very strongly. There were other problems that other people felt strongly about. I mean, it was a committed group. You know, we've all drunk the Kool-Aid. We're all in there, both feet. So people feel strongly about various and different things.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, colleagues, who would like to go first? Mark?
Sure. But,
All right, well, Corey? Who does?
I think I have my light on.
You do. It's hard to tell on these because,
All right. Thank you very much for all the work that went into this. Staff, contractors, committee, everybody, tons of work. Great job. Thank you also for the presentation. I really appreciate that. Before I get into my questions, Peter, do you have a response to the letter? You'd mentioned to me that you wanted to just respond to the letter from Mr. Wagner. So if you could maybe
Yes, I'm
offer
happy to
your
respond
thoughts
to
about
that. At some point, if it pleases the committee, I'd love to hear from Gil Friend, our Chief Sustainability Officer, as well as Shiva from our Utility Department. So if you can slice out some time for them to say a few words, that would be appreciated. So if I could direct your attention to the letter, if everybody has a copy, rather than read Mr. Wagner's comments, I'm going to respond. Just read our response.
Yeah, we've already had a chance to read it, so you can just read the responses.
So, a general answer to his letter, the Green Building Advisory Group, or what we call the GBAG, has been meeting since 2013. We highlighted these issues in the Green Building Retreat in August and identified these areas that we wanted to pursue a leadership position in. We have reviewed the draft ordinance in 2 separate meetings before tonight and have heard from all members and have addressed the concerns in amendments we are proposing and in training we'll be conducting going forward. So the amendments that we've proposed at the end of the slide deck are direct feedback that we've gotten in response to the review of the ordinance, which have been reflected. In response to question 1, the study does show a 15% compliance margin, is cost effective using the California Energy Commission's, quote, life cycle cost methodology, quote. The methodology has been used since 2005 code cycle and is accepted as the industry standard in California. The 15% was what TRC concluded was cost-effective and achievable in new buildings. As a work toward a ZNE code, this is an intermediate step and one that works towards the overall goal of first building structures that are tight and insulated, and then offsetting energy use through the innovative appliances and even solar offsets. So in summary, what we're trying to do, we didn't just arbitrarily come up with the 15 and 5%. These were studied, and in fact, the cost effectiveness study demonstrated that we could go even further than 15%, but we dialed it back to 15 for new and 5 for existing buildings. To answer Mr. Wagner's question, number 1A, builders who find it difficult to achieve the compliance margin have the option to implement the set of measures in the cost effectiveness study. The measures in the study were drawn from Code and Standards Enforcement, or CASE, measures proposed for the 2016 Title 24 code, and leverage the in-depth market cost and energy savings research that each of these case studies completed. The measures proposed in the cost effectiveness study are included in the 45-day language recently published by the California Energy Commission. Thus, the California Energy Commission believes that California building industry is prepared for implementing these measures and that Palo Alto building industry will be ahead of the curve in implementing these measures. As I mentioned earlier in our slide deck, these are aggressive goals, but they're not that aggressive. The California Energy Commission is going to be mandating many of the measures that we're proposing tonight in the next code cycle. To answer question 1B, the results of the cost effectiveness study do not indicate a bias towards larger 2-story homes, as Mr. Wagner suggested. The single-story home with high-performance attic and an instantaneous water heater was a compliance margin of 23% over base code. So that's important to note. We only marked it at 15%. The 2-story home has a compliance margin of 21% over the base code. Both prototypes far exceed the 15% threshold recommended by the ordinance. These results are included in comments submitted to the Green Building Advisory Group back on February 25th. And then finally, to answer item 1C, Build It Green served its purpose when green buildings was new to the industry. Today, the Green Building Code has been in existence, voluntary for 1 code cycle and mandatory for 2 code cycles, so it's had some time to sort of vet itself out, and is more enforceable. The building codes that we've proposed are more enforceable way to ensure that buildings are meeting specific areas that we deem are necessary. Build It Green is a point-based system that is separate and apart from a code enforcement-based system and can lead to point chasing, and in some cases requiring projects to add scope just to meet the minimum requirements of the Build It Green criteria. Build It Green is one, and arguably not the most comprehensive building rating system. It also does not ensure buildings meet minimum mandatory measures of the Green Building Code, so we can't use it in place of the Green Building compliance. We continue to support Build It Green, U.S. Green Building Council, Living Building Challenge, and other green building systems as optional and secondary forms of certifying a building. To answer Mr. Wagner's question 1D, the advisory group and staff agreed to remove Quality Insulation Installation, or QII, from the list of prerequisites required for Tier 1 and Tier 2 to address this concern. To answer question 2A, StopWaste.org has done a side-by-side comparison of Build It Green Tier 1 and Tier 2, which have been circulated to the group. We've discussed the topic of reverting to a code-based system to systemize our green building compliance while using the third-party inspectors to ensure compliance. So there may still be a role for the green building, the Build It Green rater to help us enforce the green building code. Using a building code-based system allows us to enforce the building code similar to how other parts of the building code are enforced. We want to ensure green building compliance is held as a high regard and enforcement as other provisions of Title 24, such as accessibility, water efficiency, etc. And the way to do that is by making it part and parcel to all the inspections our building inspectors do. We don't want green building inspection to be a sidebar. We want it to be integral to the building. So we need to make sure the building inspectors that see the entire process of building that building to have an eye and ear out for green building and energy efficiency code requirements. To answer question 2B, this is still acceptable as an option, but in lieu of Tier 1 and Tier 2 compliance. Not in lieu of Tier 1 and Tier 2 compliance. So the green building rating could be used in addition to our minimum requirements. And finally, we look forward to continuing to work with the Green Building Advisory Group over the next months and years to partner in the enforcement and compliance of these provisions, as well as work through the next code cycle as we amend the code, which, like I mentioned, will be right at the heels of this process.
Thank you.
And if the chair will allow it, I just wanted to ask Judith Wasserman, the one member of the committee that was here, did you have any responses to item 1B or any of the comments that Peter just made?
Oh, sure. I mean, you obviously don't know me very well. I have a response to everything. There are some details, as they're saying nowadays, in the weeds that the code seems to think are a good idea that just don't sound right. I'll give you an example. The code seems to really like on-demand water heaters. And they say that these are cost-effective because all you have to do is, they're not expensive, and all you have to do is pop them in. They don't take any maintenance. Well, that isn't true. If you want to put an on-demand water heater in an existing house, you have to upgrade your gas lines, because though they don't use a lot of gas over the length of their, of a day, when they fire up like salamanders. So you have to have a 1-inch gas line, and most houses don't. 3/4. Most houses have 1/2 inch. And they are beginning to jam up with hard water residues. Palo Alto, because we use Hetch Hetchy water, has generally fairly soft water. This is starting to change with the drought. The quality of our water is getting worse. And so this is just our ordinance. I can just speak for Palo Alto, but it's my thinking in that particular case is it's not a good idea. And I'm not saying that the ordinance is full of these problems, but there are some. And I think what we as the GBAG was trying to do was address those problems. The QII was a big one, and that's coming out, thank God. And also that crazy little bit with the energy business in the 2 tiers, where the California ordinance requires more than we require. For additions and remodels, it's very, very difficult to beat California requirements. New houses, you can do almost anything. There are other weird things, like this whole new extra insulation wall construction that if you just look at it, doesn't sound very expensive, but there's a learning curve in the labor market who have never seen this. I mean, the contractors don't read this stuff. So we detail these things and they look at them and they say, what? That's not how we do it. Well, now you do, and somehow you're going to have to learn how. And that costs money because they're not very good at it, takes them longer. They're going to charge for the learning. So that never got folded into the cost effectiveness study as far as I could tell. I could be wrong. But there were some things like that that just sort of made some of us really nervous about how this was all going to work in the field.
And specifically on the issue of 2-story or 1-story homes, Peter talked about a 1-story home that has an attic. And do you have any response to that in particular?
Yeah, if you jump through a few extra hoops, you could make your smaller house work. But it's easier to do a bigger house because you have more material to work with. It's just sort of an economy of scale issue. There are some things that don't work for larger houses, taller houses anyway. Using solar energy to offset your energy use. You know, the more square feet you have, the harder it is to get your solar power to do all your work for you. So that might work better on smaller houses. But generally speaking, having to do all this special construction to make your house work, I think penalizes, and you know, if you're looking at sustainability, nothing is quite as sustainable as small.
Thank you, Judith.
Yeah,
Corey,
I'll let it go to others, and I'll maybe if I have a couple more questions
okay,
later.
great. I think Peter had mentioned that it would be helpful to hear from Shiva from the Utilities Department and Gil, our Sustainability Director. Shiva, you have any comments to share with us?
Just to say that the utilities was part of this process, and we are gearing up to support this ordinance as it becomes implementable to provide rebates. But also these savings which we get from these additional standards will count towards our regulatory requirement with the CEC for energy efficiency. So we're part of the group. We see it's not necessarily an easy task to get to the next level, but a necessary step to get to where we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Gil, welcome.
Good evening, council members. I'm Gil Friend, Chief Sustainability Officer. Thank you for the chance to say a few words. I just really want to make a couple of points here. I was part of this year-long collaboration that Peter described, a small part of it with a very large group of people, I guess 30 or so people involved over the course of the year. And to my view, this is a very impressive example of stakeholder engagement. It was a broad and diverse group dealing with very broad mapping of issues and really thoughtfully prioritizing the impacts of the different measures that are being considered, considering appropriate intervention points of where's the best place in the building universe to act most effectively. And a real big learning for me was looking at the ability of both staff and the building industry to absorb the kind of changes. Sort of, a reality check of is there capacity, is there skills, is there ability in the industry to do what we might want to ask them to do, and then a phased program in the sequence of code cycles that Peter talked about. And I'll confess that, like Judith and like Mr. Wagner, I had some frustrations in the process too. There were things that I would have liked to see included in the cycle this year that weren't. But this is a process of a diverse group of people thinking through what makes sense. And I think nobody got absolutely everything they wanted in there. That's sort of how it works. You guys know this better than we do. I'm reminded by Bernice Reagan of the Smithsonian Institution, who said that if you're in a coalition and you're not really frustrated, a lot of the time, your coalition's not broad enough. And this was broad, and it was ultimately wise. I would echo what Judith said at the beginning. If we get into doing a line-by-line examination of this thing, we can unpack every piece of it for a long time to come. I'm inclined to say, pretty darn good. Let's go with what we have here and then improve it in the next cycle, because this is really a way to continue to keep Palo Alto in the forefront and to stay in front at a pace that's digestible for the practitioners who have to do it. From my perspective, this is a really critical part of what we've been talking about with the sustainability and climate action plan, because this is one of the places where the rubber meets the road, where the grand ideas get translated into real stuff in the real world with wood and steel and insulation and dollars and cents and energy. It's part of exploring part of the process of exploring whether and how we can make this a carbon neutral city. And so finally, I would just say, again, referencing something that Judith said, I actually don't think that we stop at zero. Zero is the next target. Once we see that we can get to zero, we can start talking about net positive buildings that actually add quality, add energy, add better air to the environment, rather than just not doing more damage. So this is the first step at a ongoing process that we're going to take through, a bunch more code cycles. I think the commitment of this city to stay ahead of the state, which is already ahead of the country, is pretty impressive. We have the opportunity, given our resources and financial and intellectual capacity here, to push the boundaries in ways that some cities can't. So kudos to the team. I've been very impressed at how the staff has organized and managed a not just complicated but complex process and come out with a really good platform for the next step.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Corey, did you have additional questions?
I'll hear from you.
Okay. Would like to go next. Tom?
You ready, Mark?
Mark, you ready? Great.
I don't have a ton of questions, more comments, I think. One question was, so the states came out with this round of codes in 2013. We're getting to our piece of the puzzle in kind of early 2015. They're going to come out with a new round of codes in 2016. And then when are we going to be, when will, I guess, the community team kind of re-engage and come up with additional measures for the city to take? I mean, you had the time frame. I lost it, and we don't have the slides. But was that going to be? Yep, there it is. So right afterwards. So 2 years from now, we'll be taking another bite at the apple, if you will.
Well, essentially, yeah. I mean, it's immediate. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Melanie. It's immediate because we need to start thinking about what do we want in the next code cycle. So literally, as soon as we go to the council, we're going to be calling the Green Building Advisory Group back and asking them to sit, and we start the process from scratch.
Yeah, and it's, what do we want in the next cycle in terms of improvements? It's also evaluating this past cycle, what worked, what didn't, and tweaks that can be made to kind of course correct if we find that certain parts of this code or this ordinance didn't work out quite as planned. And so that ability to iterate and that ability to iterate pretty quickly gives me a little bit of comfortability with the fact that maybe this isn't perfect. Maybe some inadequacies will come out in the implementation, but those can be corrected pretty quickly in the next cycle if they do exist. So that's something to consider as we decide. How finally we want to pick apart the proposal. I was excited to see a couple of things, the solar ready element and the laundry to landscape element, remind me a lot of what we did a year or two ago with EV wiring for new residential construction, just getting ahead of the curve and doing it when it's cheap as opposed to once the building's already built and then it's more expensive to go back and fix it afterwards. So I think that's really smart and can yield a lot of positive impact for hopefully minimal cost. I think that was. I'm glad that Judith was here. I'm glad that Mr. Wagner, proposed some concerns. I think that Gil's comments of, you have 30 people and the end result isn't going to make everybody 100% happy. I mean, the term that I use is everyone says they want a win-win, but a win-win is often when everyone feels like they lost a little. And if that's the case here, then that's completely understandable when you have a community group of 30 people, I'm sure, all with different backgrounds and viewpoints and agendas. So I, obviously want to hear what my colleagues have to say, but I was pretty satisfied with the answers that I've heard so far to the concerns that have been brought up.
Thanks. And colleagues, just a reminder, when we have this meeting, the lights don't correlate, so just give a flag. Tom?
Slightly different question. I got an email from a resident several weeks ago about cisterns, and I didn't see anything in here necessarily about cisterns. But the question was, I guess this is about a rebate program that this particular resident was looking at a 7,000-gallon tank, and the residential rebate is capped at $1,000, where businesses are capped at $10,000. I don't know if any of you guys saw that email, but the question is, if a resident's willing to put in a large cistern, why not rebate them, I guess, on par with a business rebate?
That's a question I'd have to take back and speak to our utility partners about, because they would be, I'm thinking that's a rebate that comes from the utilities for water efficiency, but I'd have to go back and speak to our partners in utilities.
Okay. Maybe I could forward you this email just so you have the details.
Please.
Couple of things. You said something early on that, so we have the proposed ordinance here. I thought I heard you say something like there were some bullet points that were going to be added in. Can you explain that a little further?
Okay, so at the last slide in the slide deck, you'll notice that there are 4 points. These are 3 of those points are going to be clarifications in the code. The last point is just a point of just re-emphasizing that we will be training and reaching out. The first point is we're going to be including a clause in the ordinance that basically provides a way out when it's not feasible or it's infeasible for small remodels or the like to meet the 5% reach code that we've asked them to reach. And we're going to define that so that it's not open to everybody, but that it's really due to an infeasibility. Let's say that the architect designs a house, they've done everything they can, but they're still not able to get that 5%. Our chief building official would be able to work with them, make the determination that as long as they meet code minimum, they've done everything they can to work in the intent, in good faith, towards meeting that additional 5% above Title 24. So although we can't approve projects below state standard, we can waive our 5% or 15% under these provisions.
How do we make sure we don't get backed up with requests for waivers?
Right. Well, we're going to make sure that they go through a process to make sure that they don't just not meet it because they didn't try, but they have to go through a vetting process to ensure that they did everything they could. So we're through the education, through the public outreach, we're going to be helping people identify ways that they can reach that 5% if they're a remodel or 15% if they're new. Quite honestly, we're dealing with a very sophisticated group of architects and engineers and homeowners. We don't have those kind of problems. The problems that we have are people wanting to reach in excess and they want to create zero net energy homes. So we're not really concerned that we're going to have a backlog of people wanting to protest exceeding energy efficiency, because these are going to pay them back over time. And the other two measures are pretty self-explanatory, but I'm happy to get into them.
So lowering residential square footage from 12 to 1,000, and, okay. Yeah, I mean, just in general, I think if you could carefully write that in feasibility exemption, you know, I think we need to look for efficiency and try to streamline appeals and things that just kind of clog up the system. You also said early on that you were starting engagement today, like you just launched a website. Is that right? Or recently?
Yes.
Yeah, so what's driving the overall timing here? I mean, you know, this letter we got here made it sound like they didn't really have much of a chance to respond.
Right.
I mean, how many meetings were there after this came out?
Okay, so when we released the ordinance, there were 2 meetings, and this will be the 3rd meeting, and we will again meet with the Green Building Advisory Group to answer any additional questions that they might have. Up until this point, we've heard from everybody that had something to say. We've addressed those comments that are ordinance specific, where we need to change ordinance language. The lion's share of the other issues, as Judith mentioned, are issues that we're going to continue to work with. We're going to continue to struggle with, because it is not a light switch, it's a compromise. Yeah. It's really, we need to find where is the right balance between the state code, our code, and the conflicts that reside in between those two. So it's not so much did we have enough engagement, it's a continuous engagement model that we'll continue to revisit over and over.
Yeah. But is there anything externally that's driving a date, or just our desire to get it done?
Well, the hard dates are the code cycle updates every 3 years. So the closer we come to the next code cycle in June of this year, I'm getting my dates mixed up, there's so many dates. June of this year is when they release the next rendition of the California Energy Code, which means that we're going to have to start getting ready for the next code cycle.
That's the next 3-year cycle?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And then the chart you showed, unless I misunderstood it, it looked like we were going to try to do an update this year and next year. It seemed like there were 2 that were about close together.
Well, what's going to happen is we're going to, if we pass this ordinance, we'll quickly start working on our next code update. And the next code update will, like Mr. Berman mentioned, will learn from this code cycle as we implement it and continue to press forward to the next code cycle. And these are iterative. So you're going to see.
So the state code cycles are 3 years apart.
Correct.
What is the intention for the city updates? Is it 2015, 2017?
So the state code cycle comes out in June, and then we are mandated to pass ours by January, that following January. So in 2016, the state, basically in June, they come out with their code, and then in January 2017, we have to have adopted our code. So basically between June and January, we're going through the process of first reading, second reading, et cetera.
Yeah. So again, I'm just trying to understand, this one.
Yes.
And the next one seem like they're much closer together than 3 years.
That's because there was, the California Energy Commission had a delay in when they released their code. Rather than releasing it in June, they had some modeling problems, and they postponed it till January. So we didn't have a full 3 years in this code cycle. We had really more like 2.5. And because of the procurement issues that we had, you know, we lost 6 months in that process. So that's why it looks like we have less time.
Okay. And was there any discussion about, you know, what that means on kind of the building trades, updating that frequently, or is that normal? You know?
The building trades updating.
I mean, like Judith was talking about the learning curve for construction.
That's why we're not going to stop the outreach and the education. So we quickly want to move into the training and outreach phase of this effort so we can partner with the architects. So we have many different advisory groups. We've got the Green Building Advisory Group. We've got one for PV. We've got one for EV. We've got one for the Development Center Advisory Group. So we've got many tentacles into the into our group of stakeholders to make sure that we can push out education and invite them for tutoring sessions and other engagement efforts. So we're focused on getting the word out.
Okay. And so for this ordinance, the leadership ordinance, was there any discussion about having it only apply to larger homes? I mean, was that brought up at any point? I mean, this point in the letter about difficulty with small homes, I guess you're saying that's not really accurate, but there's also the issue, I guess, of costs and being able to afford it. So I was just curious if that was discussed at all.
We did talk about possibly for net zero homes, requiring that homes above, say, 2,000 square feet have an energy cap. But we were all under the assumption that what we really need to do to make a change to the global greenhouse picture is affect not only large homes, but not only new homes, but really the existing remodels. So I mean, we were forced by the group, really engaged by the group to drive that down to capture as many construction projects as we could.
Yeah. I mean, I saw you did that for the zero net energy.
Right.
And it seems like a good way just to, as an additional way to test, roll it out for larger size homes. And once it's working, make it apply to more. That was just my impression. So did the Green Building Advisory Committee ever take votes or straw polls?
We took hand votes during the retreat on where we wanted to be in a leadership category. We described it sort of in terms of a scale of 1 to 10, how aggressive did they want to be in this area of water efficiency, in the area of energy efficiency, and we broke them down in categories. And so, yeah, there were a lot of votes.
That was in August last year, but did they have any votes once they saw the results? I mean, if there was disagreement, I'm trying to understand like how much disagreement did.
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as disagreement as much as dialogue. There were people that were really concerned about energy efficiency. Some were worried about bird strikes. Some were worried about indoor air quality. Others were worried about landscaping and water efficiency. So, there are a lot of topics around green building. It's not just one. And so there was a lot of discussion. And so along the way, we've kind of continued to mold what you have before you today.
Okay. I'm curious on the cost effectiveness study. And I'm sorry if I missed it in the report. Like, what kind of time frame do you use to look at the payback?
I'll let Farhad speak to that.
It's a 30-year time frame for, but basically that comes from how long a measure lifetime is expected to last once you install it. So it's a 30-year payback.
Okay. And simple question. The solar readiness thing, the 500 square feet, is that just your, are you actually doing anything to the roof, or it's just an empty area on the roof?
So it's a dedicated solar zone, so meaning for future installation.
There's no like brackets or anything extra?
What there is conduit, which is basically empty piping that goes from the electrical panel up to the roof line, which allows a solar installation to occur with more ease.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not really very costly, I mean?
No.
Okay. I have kind of a general question, and maybe I'm joining the party late. There was an implicit assumption, I guess, that we want to be ahead of other cities. So what are the costs and benefits to Palo Alto of being ahead?
Well, one of the costs were identified in the cost effectiveness study. And so that's one way to look at cost. Another way to look at cost would be how quickly are contractors able to absorb these changes that maybe other cities aren't requiring. That's a little harder to speak to, but in our experience, the caliber of contractor that we see in Palo Alto is a step ahead of other cities. You're talking about a very distinct property value, much higher than if you go 5 miles north or south. So we're really capturing the top tier of not only architects but contractors. Asking the question of my building inspectors, how often do you see instant water heaters versus tanked water heaters? We see more instances of the instant hot water heaters being installed just by choice. Not just one, but multiple instant hot water heaters throughout the house, one per laundry room, per bathroom, etc. So we're talking to other building inspectors in other cities. Again, the caliber is much different. We're seeing a higher caliber of construction here, tighter insulation, tighter construction. So the learning curve isn't as great here as in other cities.
Okay. And we're also seeing a very high cost of housing and just being ahead of that curve. Are we perpetuating?
The cost is really in the land, not so much in the construction. So what we're talking about is building a tighter framed home. And the incremental cost difference in doing that is not substantial. It's not so substantial that it'll create a big enough impact where we would maybe scale back. So I mean, this is what we've really been focused on is the actual construction of the physical framing, which won't change over time. And we could have very easily required technology advancements to install, like HVAC systems or heat pumps or other technologies that will change over time. So what we're really focused on is make the bones of the house very tight, and then if you install high caliber appliances after that, that's even better. That's going to make it even more energy efficient. But that's where we see the trend of the industry going, and that's where we focused our efforts.
Okay, I appreciate that. But I mean, I guess the way I'm thinking about it too, though, if we're on the leading edge, we are incurring those costs of teaching people how to build these houses. And so it seems like we would, the learning cost of people learning how to build here first, and then once they know how, other cities follow behind and kind of get the benefits of that. But, okay, well, thank you. Appreciate you going through that.
Well, first, let me try to tackle that high-level question on why we would want to lead in this arena. From a purely cost standpoint, in addition to what Peter said of the cost of construction not being our primary driver, but the cost of land, and this not being a significant component of additional cost of construction, but if we assume that the cost effectiveness is a valid analysis, then whatever incremental cost of construction shows up in the mortgage payment, and that is offset by the reduced cost of utilities. And so there would, in theory, not be a net impact on cash flow costs to someone who's building either a remodel or a new home. Well, yeah, and after 30 years, if it's still working, then it's net gain. But it's not an increase in year one. Second, we've had over many years, over a succession of city councils reflecting community values that Palo Alto has embraced both a sense of responsibility toward high environmental standards and a willingness and a determination to be leaders for the purpose of helping to establish new and better practices that would be models, just as California has done the same thing. Nationally, energy efficiency standards that were pioneered in California and renewable portfolio standards that were pioneered in California and were initially thought to be questionable as to whether they were really able, something that could be followed elsewhere, have eventually served the nation well by establishing more efficient appliances and a whole myriad of things. Same thing on the renewable portfolio. Palo Alto led in renewable portfolio, initially with ahead of California, and each step along the way we've been ahead. And lo and behold, we have lower electricity costs with cleaner electricity than any surrounding city. So these are not necessarily net costs, but they have reflected values that have been long held by this community. So I would say any change from that would need to have a high-level policy discussion on reconsidering our value structure, which I wouldn't support. Anyway, moving on to more specifics. I'll take this slide that's up here now. On the net zero time frame, first, step one is, it's step two, I should say. Step one after, the next step after this one is larger residential. And not until 2025 are we talking about some commercial. Can you, I know it's not the primary focus tonight, but can you touch on the question of why it would go in that sequence? Is this being driven by the state sequencing? And does it necessarily follow that that's the sequencing that we should proceed with? And part of why I'm thinking this is based on what Judith and others have talked about on essentially the economy of scale and larger buildings. Many of these efficiencies have better paybacks in larger buildings, and the average commercial building is larger than the average residential, and there are certainly large commercial buildings that are many times larger than the largest residential. So why wouldn't we move toward commercial first?
Thank you. So it's been looked at the state as, well, if you look at technology, homes are a much more simpler application of a building design and construction process. So that's, I can't speak on behalf of the Energy Commission, but that's the industry chatter that that's the direction and why that was chosen first. Now, commercial construction does have inherent issues that the Energy Commission is addressing first that prohibit this kind of zero net energy approach to design and construction. Mainly around the loads of the building, how much energy it's drawing at certain times, and the ability of renewable technology where it is now to fulfill in those loads. So those are some of the concerns and the reason for pushing it off longer than the residential construction. Did you have some?
My firm has been involved with a lot of the roadmaps to ZNE and served as a consultant for the state. And along with lines with what Melanie says, the loads that appear in residential buildings are generally lower than you would see in a commercial building because of the more intensive appliance use or process loads that you usually see in commercial buildings. Some of the first commercial buildings that are recommended to be adopted for the ZNE roadmap are buildings like schools and warehouses, as opposed to offices and more intensive energy intensive types of commercial buildings.
So I appreciate that there's a wide range of inherent energy use in different commercial applications, from manufacturing processes that may be very high intensity versus server farms or those kinds of things. But this doesn't say, this says 2025 for some commercial. So we're saying that for the state, 2020 for residential, for us 2016 for larger residential, and no commercial until 2025. So I guess this is something that I'd like to understand when would be the correct opportunity for this to come back before this committee or the council to make sure that this sequencing that the state is doing is necessarily what we want to do here in Palo Alto. So I guess that I'll be interested in first knowing what that opportunity would be, and then hearing from my colleagues on whether we would want to have a discussion about that opportunity. Okay. So I'll let you kind of think, unless you have a ready answer.
No, I think that's a great point of discussion that we can definitely tear off of from here. So I don't think it's written in stone. These are rough timelines that we've put into place. We've identified that there's bigger hurdles to be had in dealing with net zero commercial than net zero residential. There's a lot of running examples today of net zero energy homes. There's much fewer examples of net zero energy commercial buildings. Warehouses are easier, public schools are easier, but office buildings, you're talking about a very dense system that's packing a lot of people with very little floor area.
Provided that they don't have surface parking and a whole bunch of solar array
Right.
potential. So that's the
It's a great point.
kind of scenario where not all commercial is going to be alike. So if it's a comparatively low consumption use of commercial with a high land area, then it might be much more readily doable than what you were describing. And I know for our efforts to have net zero buildings downtown, we run into those very things you were describing. Okay, so not wanting to try to resolve that tonight, but want to look at whether there's an opportunity to, in the future, to reconsider the sequencing. And then within the larger residential, where does multifamily fit in that? Is that a large residential or are these large single family?
Yes, the step 2 references larger single-family homes. So multifamily would be addressed at some level between step 2 and step 3. We haven't fleshed that one out yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it might even be before step 3, but at worst at step 3, huh?
That's correct.
Great, thank you. I just slightly missed when you were talking about the threshold going from 1,250 down to 1,000 square feet. Was that for remodel thresholds, or what was that on? I just didn't get the context for that threshold.
So that references both new construction and remodel projects. And the reason for it being that, so that projects that trigger one ordinance will also trigger the other ordinance in sync with one another.
So at below that 1,000 square foot threshold, there's no mandate at all, right? And above it, there's the full mandate?
That's correct. Below that threshold would be just the state requirements, the minimum state requirements.
Okay.
So we wouldn't be putting the burden on projects that were less than 1,000 square feet.
I see. Well, just one thought is, and I'm not necessarily advocating that at this time, but as we go forward is, would we want to consider a lower requirement, but still something in between for, say a 500 square foot addition? And I don't know the answer to that, but rather than having a single trigger point that says above this, 1 foot above it, and you're there, nobody's going to build 1 foot above it, I can tell you. There'll be a lot 1 foot below it. And so that just making essentially a couple of tiers, is that an alternative way to look at it? Yeah. And we can maybe leave that for the next version. On the solar ready status, I know that some cities are actually requiring solar installation on new construction, and others are examining doing that. We're not looking at that. Was there a consideration of that?
Yes, there was. Lancaster, for example, requires solar on new homes.
And I know Atherton is considering it.
Yeah, the conflict that we had is along the trees. So a lot of times, new homes being constructed with a dense tree canopy around them. So there really isn't an opportunity for solar. So for us to mandate them to install solar seemed a little bit too aggressive. So we wanted to remove barriers. We don't know where those trees are going to be there in 5 or 10 years. It's really up to the property owner. But we thought that removing all the barriers to entry, and the real barriers are not only the conduit, but the panel type. So oftentimes people that install panels don't install the right type of panel, and taking that after you construct is a huge barrier to entry. The solar panels are becoming cheaper and cheaper over time, and that's not really the burden to entry. It's really all the legwork that goes into upgrading the panel from 100 to a 200 amp service and making from a center pad to a multi-fed panel. So
Although my understanding is that it's far lower cost to install the solar at the time of construction than even a subsequent installation that was teed up like this is. But I understand this issue about not all sites being good solar sites. But we have an exception process that we've already adopted in here. Why wouldn't we be able to have something like that for the solar installation requirement? So we say the default is solar installation. If you have pre-existing conditions that simply make you have a poor solar siting, that qualifies for an exception. And I think, I mean, there's a rating system on solar efficiency for every site that installers do, and it seems like we could have an objective standard that, based upon that analysis, if it's below this number of performance, you'd qualify for the exception, so it wouldn't have to be an arbitrary exception even. And then the second issue of over time of what to do with trees that are growing, that's a significant issue that actually was, I think, recently addressed through state legislation, if I recall.
Yes, Solar Shade Act.
Yeah. So why couldn't we have the solar as a default, allowing for exceptions?
Well, that's a great question, and we can. We thought that, as a group, as a committee, we thought that this was the first entry point, and it'd be a very easy way to enter the market. But we could very easily discuss that going forward into the next code cycle, which is just a year away. The issue is that we'd have to do a cost effectiveness study for that mandate, because it would be in excess of Title 24. And what we're hearing, and maybe Farhad can speak to this, I don't know if the numbers actually support mandating solar installations on homes, but something that we could study for sure.
Yeah, from our experience, it's very dependent on the utility usage of that home, and it would require a comprehensive analysis to do that kind of thing. The measures that we were looking at, that we researched here, are based on the 2016 code implementation, and they were solar-ready measures that they were looking at, not necessarily mandating photovoltaics or solar.
So if it's not typically cost-effective, how do companies like Solar City that do the financing off of reduced utility bills manage that?
Yeah, from my perspective, those are typically longer paybacks, 20, 25 years sometimes. And it's
You
not
said 20 to 25 years?
It's not for every house.
But I thought our calculation on cost effectiveness was a 30-year.
Yeah, it's on a 30-year payback cycle. So,
right. So if they're getting 20, 25 years at worst, and ours is 30 years, why wouldn't ours calculate?
It's worth investigation.
Okay. All right. Well, let's put that in the bucket of things that we might want to have come back for policy consideration on yeah, does the council want to request that to be evaluated for the next cycle? And I suppose you could be doing these things outside of council policy direction, just under your broader mandate to look at various efficiencies, but I kind of think that we don't want, we have as a practice of our committees not giving policy direction. That should come from the whole council. So,
thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, just to add on that, what the Green Building Advisory Group had discussed at one point was the solar readiness being a step in the direction of zero net energy. And at the level of zero net energy, it almost requires a solar installation. So that this was our
either that or no
step.
lights.
So I think we have addressed it just in a different way, but I think we'll take it back and address it directly as requested.
Thank you. You mentioned, and you mentioned it as an aside, but I think this laundry to landscape, you said that already doesn't even require a permit in Palo Alto. Is that correct?
That's correct. So today, someone could install one of these systems. By mandating it as part of the initial construction, we can ensure that it's done properly.
Well, I get that. My point was how many residents know that that is something, especially in these drought years, that that's something that we could readily do. I tend to think it's more efficient than my wife capturing quarts of water and taking them to the garden from our dishwashing. So like some of our better initiatives, they aren't widely known by our residents. And so that's outside of the scope here, although I know that you have, different PR and training parts to this. But I'd encourage to look at a way for us to really inform the community. Maybe it would be in our utility bill inserts, because it may have come about sometime, and if it did, it kind of reminds us that we probably need 2 different times for that to be in an insert, for it to register to enough of us that we pay attention. Because that sounds good, and it sounds like a pretty low cost installation, right? Great. When we look at, when the state looks at these types of formula that we're now utilizing in our new code, is there an acknowledgement that there's a different calculus towards switching, environmental benefit calculus, towards switching to electricity, what we were calling electrification? I'd suggest maybe we come up with something that's maybe clean electrification, or something that makes clear to people what we're talking about. That there's a greater environmental benefit of switching to electricity in Palo Alto with 100% carbon neutral portfolio than there is in Southern California, where they may be running a portion off of coal-fired power plants. And I'm not sure that that whole environmental benefit analysis applies equally in our environment versus elsewhere. Any concerns or thoughts on that? Would it change what we would say are our highest environmental priorities if that was part of the equation?
Well, this is part of the struggle that we have in dealing with the California Energy Commission. The way they see electricity is still in the old definition of electricity that's generated from coal-powered plants that have a tiered system that becomes a lot more expensive the more you use, and what we're trying to move towards is a clean model of electricity. So it's a state system, so this is a point of huge debate and struggle for us, and it's something that we've been talking to Gil about. It's been something we've been talking to utilities about, but it really does ding us when we mandate, for example, that homes go to all electric, and it's something that we're studying in the fuel switching exercise, but it's going to require some conversations with the California Energy Commission.
Okay, and I'll just say that on this at a high level, on some of these struggles to have regulatory requirements align with some of the leading edge approaches, such as our clean electricity. I've spoken with our local legislators, and they are open to carrying legislation that would help correct these issues. But we haven't provided them specifics of what we'd like changed. And I'm actually hungry to know what those specifics would be. And Peter, I actually have a second reason that I would like to be able to get any, not specific wording, but a little better understanding of this, and maybe we could talk offline about that in the next couple of days, if that's possible.
Sure thing.
Great, thanks. Finally, do we have some sense of what will be the beneficial impact of these changes over whatever time horizons? So we're doing these things. We all feel that these are the right direction, clearly, that they're beneficial, but I don't have any sense of how this will translate into aggregate benefits in terms of environmental impacts. Over what
Oh.
time frame?
Yes, so in terms of the measurements, I'll address that first question. The process that we're setting up is a comprehensive survey of buildings to actually measure the savings, which equates to greenhouse gas tons avoided. So we're measuring that, and that is part of our annual SEA Earth Day reporting in coordination with Gil's leadership. And at the state level, the California Energy Commission also has multipliers that translate to greenhouse gas avoided. So those are some of the measurements over time that the California Energy Commission is using. And
So there's an anticipation that these actions will correlate to a certain amount. That's been calculated, even though that's a projection. It's there and available.
Yes, absolutely. That's there's a long process that the Energy Commission goes through to evaluate each measure and the savings. Do you want to? Is there anything?
Yeah, for each measure that makes it into the Title 24 code, what's known as a case study is completed for that measure that results in the lifetime energy savings, gas savings, electricity savings, as well as greenhouse gas savings of that measure. And they also do other environmental impacts, potentially more materials or water impacts as well. But
If it's relatively simple to do, and feel free to tell me if it's not, at a high level, could some reference point of that beneficial impact be included when this goes to the full city council? So that we basically are saying, we're doing all this, and here's what we think will be the benefit. I mean, I'm not requesting if it's going to be a significant amount of additional work.
Yes, we can include the greenhouse gas calculations in
Great.
the projections.
And we typically talk about the greenhouse gas reductions in tons of greenhouse gases or CO2. And I don't know anybody who can actually envision what a ton of CO2 looks like. And so I think adding a percentage improvement is probably more meaningful or something. I mean, I know people who are immersed in the field deal with this concept day in, day out, but the average person says, wow, tons of CO2, that sounds like a lot, or is that a little? And we don't really know. So some metric that begins to have, so the average home that gets built under this standard will have this much percent less energy use, or something like that might be a way to approach it.
It looks like TRC can provide that for us.
Yeah.
We'll make some assumptions
Great.
and identify what those assumptions are, and then provide a % improvement over previous code.
Good. Corey, did you have any follow-ups?
Yeah, actually I did. Yes, I do have a couple other questions. If I can find my notes. So, shoot, where did I put my notes? Anyway, just kind of a procedural question. Looking at this slide here, we're talking about additional proposals that are beyond what we got in our packet, or are these, no, the slide we just had up?
Oh.
Slide 10?
The last one.
Okay, so these are additional changes beyond what we were given, or are those just highlights from what we were given?
Correct. Those will be introduced into the ordinance by the time this goes to council.
Okay, so is there still an opportunity to make additional changes beyond those before it goes to council?
Provided we don't have to do any kind of cost effectiveness study or additional, community outreach, yes.
Okay. And one item in particular, in Mr. Wagner's letter, Peter, you said that item 2B, the GPR certification was an option that could have been included. I'm not immersed in this field enough to speak with authority about that. You said it could be included, it couldn't be included. Do you have a recommendation? Obviously, it wasn't included, so I guess there's an implicit recommendation against its inclusion. Any more
I'd love
thoughts
to
on
shed
that?
some light on that. So what we're saying is that the mandate is that Tier 1, Tier 2 be complied with. In addition, if you'd like to be a Living Building Challenge, USGBC, BIG, or any other rating system, we welcome it, and we would, we'd encourage it, but we're not going to mandate it.
Okay. As the ordinance is written now, and with at least the version that will come to council, do we do anything to provide additional incentives beyond mandates for things like those other standards, or for instance, for installation of solar? Not a mandate, but any kinds of incentives.
We are working with utilities and creating some incentives. They're in a group buy program right now, I think with Redwood City, where they're trying to drive down the cost of the individual panels by buying them in bulk. So there's an opportunity there for residents to drive down the cost of the actual panels. And utilities, what we're doing is helping them, and I wish Shiva was here to speak to it more, but when they're able to offer incentives when we have a REACH code that is in excess of the code minimum. So by providing this REACH code and approving it, we're giving utilities the ability to incentivize those improvements above minimum code. So, and they have programs that deal with water efficient landscaping. They pay more per square footage to rip out your sod and put in drought tolerant landscaping than any other municipality. And they have a variety of other incentive programs that we partner with very closely.
Okay, and also there it is, finally found my notes. The three-way diverter valve for gray water, how much does that cost? I'm not familiar with that. We had a question about the conduit earlier. I appreciate you clarifying about that. I was pretty sure that would be fairly inexpensive. The three-way diverter valve, is this $10, $100, $1,000?
From our informal cost research, it was a range between $200 and $400 for the valve.
Including the valve itself or installation included?
That was including just the valve, so we didn't get labor costs, but we can certainly gather that information if requested.
Okay, I think that's it for my questions. I don't know if we want to start moving towards a motion here.
I have a question about the motion. Since we don't have the final ordinance itself and there's going to be changes, can we just move that it comes to council as an action item?
Well, I'd suggest that we have the motion and reference the changes proposed by the CBAG that have been supported by staff. And we have it before us, and I don't think we have to read the book.
But we don't really have the language, I guess. I mean,
Pardon me?
But we don't have the language itself, so I'm wondering.
Yeah, and I think it's typical, or common, I should say, for us to, we'll have the opportunity of council to review the language, but we can refer it to the council based upon this. I don't go through and scrutinize every word of the ordinance. We basically adopt things in principle, and occasionally we may look at nuances of language, but it's not our primary task.
Yeah, I guess it's really a question of, does it go on consent or on action item?
Well, if it's unanimous, it'll go on consent unless there's a determination that it's a significant enough item. And this is going to come under our kind of consolidation of green initiatives under Earth Day. Is that going to be on that council meeting? And so for that reason, would it be coming as an action item rather than a consent, so that we would? Oh.
It would need to come in as a public hearing because we're modifying an existing ordinance.
Okay, so it would not be consent either way?
No, it could.
Great, thank you.
Makes it easy.
Okay. All right. Would someone like to make a motion?
Sure. So I'll move that Policy and Services Committee refer this topic, the revised Green Building and Energy Reach Code ordinance, to City Council for public hearing and adoption of the attached ordinances as listed in the staff report. I don't know that I need to go through and read through them all.
And did you refer to this also? Inclusive of the proposed revisions by CBAG adopted or endorsed by staff? GBAG, endorsed by staff.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'll accept your amendment.
Okay, I'll second your motion.
There we go.
Okay. Any other discussion? I'll just say thanks for a lot of hard work by both staff and the GBAG committee. And it seems like it's really taking a next step. And what we've continued to see, as you mentioned earlier, goals that appear to be reaches become the next generation of standard practices and are no longer reaches. And, you know, as we've all seen, including in the private sector, and through different phases of life, the things that seem to be real challenges, we stretch ourselves, and next thing we know, they're readily accomplished. So I look forward to this falling into that category. Right. Any other discussion? No? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I should say we still need to hear back when we might be able to have discussion on kind of whether certain next generation objectives we should be folding in beyond what is that direction.
Kind of reordering.
Yeah. Yeah, Corey?
Yeah, and just to clarify a couple of things that were mentioned earlier about that I'd also like to have the chance to have the discussion about timing regarding include both multifamily residential of various sizes and also various commercial types.
And then my other one was whether we would have solar by default with an exception process. So that could go before the council as part of this for just referral for next action, or you may come up with some other way that how this comes before this committee. But as long as you're saying Cash is there, that's our next item, is look at future agendas. So if we look for some opportunity to get it back in discussion, we'll just trust that we'll figure that out.
Yes, we'll
Thank
be
you.
back for you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.
Okay, and our final item is future meetings and agendas. Cash has put before us kind of a rough draft of what we've been able to capture on what we know about upcoming policy and services agenda items for the year. I'd say at a high level, we have a lot of items with more likely to fall on the list. Does this capture some of the colleagues' memos that?
Correct, yes.
Including ones that you're aware may be in the pipeline, or only those that have come out?
Yeah, only the ones that we're aware of.
So there are likely to be other policy referrals from colleagues' memos or through other means that will get added to this list. So we shouldn't assume this is, as long as the list will get. What we want to do is see that hopefully at a certain point in time, things come off the list faster than they get added onto it. So the next process step, other than whether anybody has any specific questions or comments tonight, is that I'll be meeting with Cash to go through this and then try to bring back to us as an agendized item at our next Policy and Services Committee a discussion about our year's program.
So one item before that would help kind of determining what our agenda would be for the next meeting is, we've had to reschedule the meeting because on 4/14 is the Buena Vista full council meeting.
Right.
So we sent out a doodle, and Councilmember Burt and Councilmember Du Bois responded. And
When did it go out?
When did it go out? Last week.
The doodle did?
Yeah.
Got it.
So right now, it seems that the Wednesday, the 8th works for both of the council members,
April.
8th of April, or the 28th of April. So if we could focus on narrowing that date first, then I can speak to maybe one item in addition to the discussion of the schedule item that we could bring forward.
And my schedule now would be problematic on the 28th.
It would be, okay. So how, does a 4/8 look good for?
I can do it.
Looks good to me. That's a PTC meeting as well, right? That night?
I'm not familiar with that.
Yes.
That is a Wednesday. Yeah.
So we can just meet in there?
Yeah. The room shouldn't be a problem. Yeah. Okay, so 4/8, it looks like, okay. So if it's 4/8 or the next meeting, I think Councilmember Burt, you and I had talked about trying to bring the recommendations from the committee as a whole, specifically the City Council Policy Procedure Manual updates, at least a draft, to the April meeting. And I think we can still be on target to do that, in addition to then having a further discussion about the agenda.
I'm going to be selfish and ask when we're thinking about bringing the minimum wage ordinance, which was referred last year.
Yeah, I'd have to check with the attorneys to see on their schedule.
Okay, so is that what we're dependent on?
Correct.
But
yeah.
we don't have that on the draft here.
It is.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry.
Citywide minimum
Oh,
wage.
great,
Yeah,
great,
I
sorry.
remember that too.
And actually, Cash, I'm looking at my conflict where I'd be traveling. For some reason, I have the same trip in 2 weeks, so I'll have to double check. I might actually be also available later in the month. But if we've got the 8th, then I guess
We're going to stick with
everybody's okay with the 8th?
I can do the 20th too, but might as well do the 8th.
Are we talking about a single meeting for the month, or?
Well, that goes into a discussion we should have, which is that there's, I think, a good likelihood that we're going to have a series of months with 2 meetings in the month to be able to tackle this in a larger work program. So the question then would be, which things would be, when do we start having,
As long as you understand that during the month of May and the first part of June, we have a meeting every Tuesday and Thursday for finance. So
that's their problem. Except where the city manager and others have.
That's a clerk's office.
Yeah. It depends on whether we're trying to have the city manager be in 2 places at once. Okay, so that's important to consider for that reason. And we would want to, if we had May meetings, we'd have to look at whether there are items that would need the city manager or someone else who, probably just the city manager who would be doubling up.
Sure.
So it does, that is kind of a suggestion that we should ask ourselves whether, if we're available for the late April meeting, would we have items that would be ripe at that time?
And I can check.
Great.
I mean, I think we can safely bring back the City Council Policy Procedure Manual update to the April 8th meeting, along with the discussion of the schedule. I can check on the minimum wage and see if I doubt that could come the 8th, but I can ask and then get a sense of that.
I mean,
Is there anything else?
It's modeled off of what other communities have already done, so we're not exactly setting new legal precedent here.
Correct, yeah.
Well, we can just look at this whole list, and you'll be able to, in the next week or two, figure out whether there are some items that we could drive forward to try
Correct. And then based on the city school meeting on, I believe it's April 2nd, we're going to have a discussion about the project safety net there, and that ties into the third item on the list, the Stanford Development Agreement Health and Safety Funds.
Yeah, can I ask about that one?
What was that?
So can I ask what is that and how does it relate to Project Safety Net?
That's where the funding source for the city's funds now comes out of those development funds.
So will I, my wife works at Stanford, will I have a conflict on that item? What's the tie to Stanford?
I suspect not. Well, we'll want to check with the city attorney because those are funds that have been transferred from Stanford to us. So they were formerly from Stanford. They're our possession, and my guess is that won't be a problem.
Okay, just wanted to check. I mean, if there were Stanford items, it'd be nice if you bunched them up, and I just won't show up that
Good.
It's a good thing that people.
Yeah, so that's a consideration.
So that's a consideration for the 28th.
Great. Okay. Does that kind of tee it up enough so that?
Yeah.
So expect to get a poll on this late April meeting after Cash has a chance to look at whether there are some items that we could have ready at that time. Great. Thanks, and on that note, we're adjourned.